The thing that makes conspiracy theories really interesting is that every now and again, they turn out to be true. The Black Panther Fred Hampton was assassinated by the FBI. The US government paid $2 million in settlements to the victims of the raid that killed Hampton, and after the cover-up was exposed. The Tuskegee syphilis experiments were conducted on unsuspecting black men who were left to suffer the horrific effects of syphilis for 30 plus years. The American government organized the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Indonesian socialists and communists during the late 60s and early 70s. Former British doctor Andrew Wakefield manufactured the fearsome MMR scare, forging evidence linking vaccines to autism for his own profit and injuring real children in the process. Nixon tried to hide Watergate from the American population. The Reagan administration used the profit of selling crack cocaine to its own citizens to fight communism and the Contras in Central America. Pauline Hanson's One Nation sought donations from the NRA and private American businesses to win seats in Australian Parliament. MKUltra was a thing. They tested LSD on people to see if they could use it for mind control, and instead they came across advanced torture techniques. These, and many, many more, are definitive proof that malicious and immoral conspiracies are sometimes real, and they happen every day. Most of them, to the conspiracist's disappointment or dismay, are far more mundane than what I have listed. British psychologist Dr. Rob Brotherton quotes two conspiracy scholars, Jane and Fleming, in his book Suspicious Minds, saying that,
"As far as we are aware, we do not live in a world with one or two powerful conspiracies in operation, but in one in which millions of minor ones, and perhaps a few medium ones, are grinding away all the time. The majority of real conspiracies," they add, "are so banal it's hardly worth theorising about them."
The consequences of being caught engaged in conspiracy can be absolutely earth-shattering. Just ask Nixon. So, when it comes to alleging that a conspiracy exists, the evidence will always go back to the conspiracy theorist. A large cabal does not need to prove that it is not conspiring. All of the burden of proof is on the conspiracy theorist. And this might sound frivolous and obvious, but all of the conspiracies that I have discussed have documented evidence behind them. The theorist will propose an idea that a conspiracy exists. That idea does not will it into existence. The vast majority of the time, there is no hard evidence, there is only speculation. And that's okay, because speculation does not make us crazy or paranoid. These are entirely natural impulses, and according to Dr. Wilhelm van Prugen, they are entirely human. In his view, people tend to think of other beings as having more agency than they really possess. People are not good at predicting each other's behaviour, and we do not like it when sudden catastrophes happen. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and we like it when the world makes sense to us. We especially don't like the sensation of feeling wrong. The brain will often try to blame someone else. Multiple conspiracy scholars cite Tacitus, the great Roman historian. During the Great Fire of Rome, the populace were told that the fires were natural.
Nobody dared fight the flames. Attempts to do so were prevented by menacing gangs. Torches, too, were openly thrown in by men crying that they had acted under orders. Rumours were already spreading that while the city was burning, the young, immature, self-involved emperor had been in Antium, giving a recital.
Brotherton points out, similar sentiments were expressed during the Great Fire of London in 1666. This abstract sense-making, assigning blame where it is not readily apparent, is a deeply human response. It is understandable. We have this primal fear of the unknown, and to make us feel a little bit less afraid, our brains try to find an explanation. These exercises are rarely constructive. Even after we've been told what happened by an authority on the topic, we can still express the same sentiments through needless skepticism. As I explored in part 1 of this series, having a little bit of skepticism can be good for you, but it can be taken too far, and it can harm your social relationships. And where I live in Tasmania, if there is one historical event that can make you lose friends fast, it is speaking about the conspiracy theories that surround the Port Arthur Massacre.
On the 28th of April 1996, 35 people were murdered at Port Arthur in Tasmania. 20 of those were shot in the Broad Arrow Cafe. It was the worst massacre in Australia's history, and the shooter was quickly singled out.
First appeared here in the Supreme Court of Tasmania. Bizarrely, he pleaded not guilty.
In going into this video, I assume that you have seen part 1 of this mini-series. I will be referencing it several times here. I recount that history, not just for educational and entertainment purposes, but I need everyone watching to understand the weight of the evidence the state brought forth. Conspiracy theories conjure up fiery emotions in people. By explaining what actually happened in 1996 in Port Arthur's wake, I hope to inoculate you against the intentionally provocative questions that theorists raise. And I once again want to be upfront. The case against Blondie is absolutely rock solid, and to believe otherwise is willful ignorance. I do not believe that these conspiracy theories have any evidentiary weight behind them, and if there are any truthers in the audience, I want to help you get out of trutherism. I hope to demonstrate that you are being lied to by people who want your money and your attention, and I plan to demonstrate how in this video. So stick around, and ask you to please keep it civil. You know, I used to be a conspiracy theorist, and I do not wish to talk down to you. I hope that you will listen to my arguments, not just because I put a lot of time into this video, but because I know what it feels like to be a conspiracy theorist. It's a miserable and scary existence, and I believe that calmly explaining where people are mistaken is a much better way of getting people out.
Port Arthur truthers, or as I like to call them, PATs, have skepticism about the official narrative of the Port Arthur massacre. These conspiracy theorists allege that Blondie was simply a scapegoat for a much larger false flag attack. They believe that the massacre was a false flag operation that was undertaken to take away Australian civil liberties, specifically to enact the National Firearms Agreement to disarm the Australian populace and make them complacent.
They did everything to manipulate and coax a confession, but in their initial interviews, Bryant seems blissfully unaware of what had happened at Port Arthur. Later that day, he was at the Seascape cottage, allegedly holding owners David and Sally Martin hostage.
Oh, hello. It's Terry again. How are you? I'm fine. How's things going in there, mate? Fine, couldn't be better. Just like on a Hawaiian holiday. Hawaiian holiday? Yes, that's correct.
It is while he is on the phone to negotiate a Terry that gunshots from a second shooter in the cottage can be clearly heard.
I'm making up some sandwiches. These people have got done.
That's a lot to take in. The premise of this conspiracy theory is dramatic, and the idea is captivating on a narrative level when removed from reality. This traumatic thing was not as random after all. So, let's define some of the ideas behind this premise.
Our concept of false flag operations has shifted over time. It once started out as a sneaky naval tactic, in which a fleet would raise a white surrender flag, and then unleash hellfire upon the opposing and unsuspecting fleet. A historic example that you might be familiar with is this.
Here you see the Reichstag, the German House of Parliament in Berlin, which has been seriously destroyed by fire.
While the rubble was still smouldering, Van der Lubbe and 4 other of his compatriots were arrested, and Van der Lubbe supposedly confessed to wanting to start a workers' uprising in Germany. The Chancellor uses this as an excuse to outlaw all communist ideology in Germany, and eventually seizes power for himself. Now, I'm not saying definitively that the Nazis did it, because historians are still debating the incident, and I only remember so much of my Year 12 history class. But I believe the principle of this is still the same. The idea of a false flag is that a powerful faction commits a dramatic and violent crime in secret. This same faction acts shocked and disgusted by the violence, and uses this overstatement of harm to justify drastic action and consolidate power. Over time, a false flag went from an attack with an ulterior motive to an event that didn't happen the way the mainstream says it. This modern context, according to Mick West, comes from a string of domestic American attacks.
False flag only started being used reflexively by theorists after a sequence of 3 events: the Aurora Theatre shooting in July 2012, the Sandy Hook school shooting in December 2012, and then the largest spike after the Boston Marathon bombing of April 2013.
In the immediate aftermath of an attack like this, when there is little information about the attack, we begin to search for meaning.
The conspiracy mind, abhorring the inexplicable, rushes to fill the void with an explanation, a false flag designed to take away our guns.
Some of these attacks do have political motivations. For example, the Boston Marathon bombing was committed by 2 members of ISIS. But other mass shootings, like what happened at Port Arthur, are not politically motivated. In a morbid way, we can justify in our minds why a religious or political terrorist would do something bad. We say, oh, they were told to do it by their higher power. We don't agree with it, but we understand it. But when it comes to Port Arthur, we don't really understand why people do mass shootings. The real reasons come down to resentment and suicidality and a desire for infamy. But that is hard to understand in a clean and easy way. We cannot justify the why in our minds. So, in a vacuum such as this, we can sometimes turn to theorizing.
In these situations, a claim of conspiracy made by someone with no access to special information can't be based on careful study of evidence. It's as if the theories were prefabricated. As Emma Jane and Chris Fleming put it, these are conclusions lying in wait for friendly facts.
False flag accusations are never harmless. When Alex Jones of InfoWars told his large and aggressive audience that the victims of the Sandy Hook school shooting were paid crisis actors, the victims and their families were bombarded with hate and terrible accusations, and they later successfully sued Jones for defamation after prolonged harassment. They won $100,000 American dollars, and as recent as March 2021, he was denied appeal for his case. The father of one of the murdered children was awarded $450,000 by a jury after a series of terrible accusations from another conspiracy theorist. I explain this because conspiracy theorists do not necessarily set out with the intention to harm people. They believe that they want to help people by exposing perceived liars. But harm is a result of their accusations. Speech hurts people, especially when it is baseless. It can be defamation or libel depending on the medium. The Port Arthur massacre has its fair share of aggrieved victims, and we must acknowledge here that it is a little bit weird that some of the truthers will go after the victims of the massacre.
When it comes to false flag accusations, they feel so insidious because they minimize real pain and suffering. We speculate on complicated people who did not ask for media attention. Victims and their families did not consent, and they are dealing with the worst of situations. Secondly, we have to understand where Blondie fits into this theory. So depending on who you ask in the movement, he is either completely innocent or partially responsible for the attacks, but they all agree, however, that he was the fall guy, the one held responsible. This movement uses the word patsy, which refers to a foolish person who takes on the entire blame. So the patsy hides government involvement. Some people in this movement believe that there were multiple gunmen on the historic site and at Seascape. Now, I plan to debunk this claim in due time, but to help you understand how this movement sees Blondie specifically, we need to turn to Netflix's hit docuseries Making a Murderer. This show went viral a few years ago, and the conspiracy and true crime communities are generally well acquainted with the case. But there is one part I would like to bring your attention to: the confession tape of Brendan Dassey. This is often cited as a piece of his innocence. That sounds like a broken sentence, but the idea here is that Dassey was intellectually impaired, and the police coerced him into giving a false confession statement because they wanted to close down the case. On the podcast, Those Conspiracy Guys, host Gordon Rochford argues that a similar event may have happened during the interrogation of Blondie. His claims are based off of zero evidence. It's groundless allegation for the idea of a crime. So during the period of time between Blondie's initial not guilty plea and the second court day where he pled guilty to all charges, Blondie changed his lawyer to John Avery. During Avery's time with Blondie, he asked him to draw a map where he shot all the victims in the Broad Arrow Cafe. Rochford argues that this may have been coerced, again without any evidence. I bring up this allegation because it is a comprehensible argument, which, as we will find out in the next chapter, is pretty rare for Port Arthur truth. In fact, Avery gave his full unredacted transcripts of the conversations he had with Blondie to Wainwright and Totaro. The journalists learned that Avery got a hold of Blondie's school reports, which indicated that he did well in art. Avery, with this in mind, thought that Blondie would be more comfortable expressing what he did through drawings. The transcripts exist in the book, and the book says that Blondie presented his drawings to Avery in a subsequent meeting. So Avery did not directly coerce Blondie into drawing the map of his crime. There is no evidence that anyone else coerced him into doing anything involving this map. So here, we have a constructed victim, we have no evidence of coercion, but a will to believe in someone's innocence to justify a preconceived belief. Blondie is not a person to this movement, but he is a symbol of government interference. Behind the pretense of concern and moralizing, there is rage about having their guns taken away. Remember, conclusions lying in wait for friendly facts. Finally, we have to understand the motive behind this supposed attack. False flag attacks do not happen when any old piece of legislation needs to go through. We don't hear theorists proclaiming a random bomb threat was linked to some random piece of boring legislation about public transportation. These attacks are intended to have a psychological effect. They use a crime as a signal that indicates something is wrong in society. We use this signal crime to motivate people to change laws so it won't happen again. This type of event is often referred to as a psyop by conspiracy theorists. So, Port Arthur Truth believes the massacre happened to shock the public into a state where they would be willing to give their guns away. This feels counterintuitive to me, because if you wanted to stoke fear into the public involving guns, because when you scare people about guns, they go out and buy guns. There are multiple studies concluding that gun sales go up after a terrible event like this. People want to protect themselves. But that is not the point that Port Arthur Truth wants us to consider. Instead, they believe the government shocked the populace into giving up their firearms with the intent of making them complacent, to justify radical totalitarianism and not have the populace rise up against the government. Also, Port Arthur Truth must completely disregard normal standards of evidence. When we discuss actual uncovered conspiracies, we come across piles of the stuff. The information covering up the assassination of Fred Hampton took entire volumes to store the paperwork. Andrew Wakefield's vaccine scam ended in a 224-day-long medical trial, the longest in medical history, because there was just so much information that was discovered that it took that long to discuss it all. Real conspiracies take a lot of time to uncover, and even longer to provide a cohesive and comprehensible timeline.
So, with this in mind, over the course of the last 25 years, there has been no solid evidence against the case presented by the state of Tasmania. The court transcript, from which I get much of my information, is tainted to these people. According to them, I am inherently biased by using this as a reference point. The state is corrupt, therefore the court case was corrupt. Firstly, this ignores the separation between judicial and federal powers. Secondly, there is no way around the fact that I cannot argue these people into trusting the evidence found after months of forensic analysis, eyewitness testimony, background checking, mental health assessments, and careful checking of evidence that was treated with the utmost seriousness. So, what about the overwhelming majority of eyewitness testimony? Surely they have something to say. Well, they will accuse me of being biased as well. Some of them will just say that survivors are paid crisis actors. They're shills who are playing up the emotions for the camera. Crisis actors have their origins in disaster training scenarios. People wearing cosmetic makeup pretend to be injured so that the military or medical staff can test out procedures and train the operators to deal with emotionally charged people and scenarios. But when we consider crisis actors in a conspiracy context, this requires people to play a secret role for 25 years for seemingly no benefit. What's a couple $100,000? Why would you keep this up for your entire life? It's a ridiculous notion. This assertion can only be created if we treat the massacre as fantasy, which it was not. Conspiracy theorists don't believe in just one wacky thing. They tend to believe in lots of different conspiracies that intertwine with each other. It's a kaleidoscope of deception. For Port Arthur to have been a false flag, and for it to have been not found out after this long, the entire government would have to be in on it. Hundreds of thousands of people. The further you get into Port Arthur Truth, the more extreme and radical you have to become to maintain belief. Now, what is interesting about this feedback loop is how it collides with cognitive dissonance, which I explained in Chapter 1, Part 1. Pats tend to have extreme points of demarcation, a concept first introduced to me by Mick West, who is the founder of Metabunk. This is a forum dedicated to academically disproving conspiracy theories. This website is primarily interested in more scientific conspiracy theories, the physics of the 9/11 attacks, the chemistry behind chemtrails, and the biology of vaccines, for instance.
In fact, if you're watching this video because you want to help someone you love get out of Port Arthur truth, I cannot recommend his book Escaping the Rabbit Hole enough. He observes that 9/11 truthers tend to fall upon a 1 to 10 gradient. On this gradient, you can generally find 4 different distinct clusters. The factions are arranged by the government's involvement. Now, according to West,
well, you can usually describe any particular event, conspiracy theory, by labeling it as one of the above 4 types. It's quite rare that fits neatly within a single category. In particular, the exploitation of an event is presumed to be happening regardless of if the event was allowed, deliberate, or especially faked. Some events are supposedly halfway between allowed and deliberate, a kind of helped it happen theory. The 9/11 truthers have their own eternal taxonomies, generally referred to as IHOP. IHOP stands for It Happened on Purpose. The variations of this taxonomy relate to the degree that intentionally behind the event. The acronyms LIHOP and MIHOP were originally invented to describe a division at the less extreme end of 9/11 conspiracy theory spectrum. Did the Bush administration let it happen on purpose? LIHOP. Or did they actually proactively make it happen? MIHOP.
it is important if we're going to help people out of Port Arthur truth that we figure out precisely where it is that they stand on the event. I can only argue with one individual about what they think happened and where. And since Port Arthur truth is not a monolith, I am going to default my position to arguing against a MIHOP position. The arguments that I will be presenting also work for everyone on the lower end scale, because each point is specific to those issues. Even if you have a more LIHOP approach, my points still stand. I can still use my arguments. So going back to the 9/11 truth example, the US government goes from not knowing about the attacks to knowing about it and doing nothing, then assisting terrorists, then helping them to orchestrate the event themselves. So once you get to 10, things have become so abstract that people are saying the planes were holograms and the towers were blown up with precise detonations. The deeper the rabbit hole goes, the less people are down there. But paradoxically, and most interesting to me, even those who have a lower number than them, the people at 10 will still use the existence of everyone underneath them as proof that lots of people believe in this theory. And of course, once things become more extreme, we have to start believing in more elaborate conspiracy theories. The military, government, corporations, economists, fire departments, police, intelligence agencies, plane manufacturing and airline running corporations had to all be in on it. So we stop believing that otherwise virtuous professions are trustworthy by association, and the further away from reality, the crazier the evidence is that we need to justify going down so low.
Based on my own observations, Pats tend to be secretive, especially in Tasmania. You tend to hear these theories emerge in people when they are drunk or when they are very comfortable around you. Once unmasked, they will stick to their beliefs, but they rarely reveal their power level. That means that once they're out, they are not likely to reveal the extent of their belief in conspiracy. As shown in Part 1, Chapter 1, there is a tactical advantage in ambiguity. When you are not entirely sure what the person you're arguing with believes, it can be difficult to argue against them. They can shift their position according to your arguments. When Pats are not attacking people, I base this gradient on the 9/11 HOP scale. I believe that these conspiracy beliefs range from 1 to 10.
Cluster A are correlated in believing the Blondie was completely innocent of the crimes he committed, and that Blondie was specifically chosen to be the patsy. According to my own observations, they are more likely to reside within the middle of the HOP scale. They are far more likely to have sympathy towards Blondie's disposition. They believe that someone with ASD and someone of his intelligence could not have pulled off this plan. Cluster A are far more likely to feel distressed about all the things Blondie did not get to do in his life. They wish him happy birthday every year, and generally seem concerned about his well-being. They argue that the killer did not have the moral character nor the mental capability to commit the acts that he did. I refer to this cluster as the sympathetic cluster. Cluster B are more likely to believe that Blondie did commit some of the crimes, but he was helped by one or more gunmen. These people tend to be younger and less sympathetic towards Blondie. The fact of him being made the patsy is not the primary focus. They tend to be more involved in other conspiracy theories, and they will link the Port Arthur massacre to other events. Interestingly, because of this more scattered approach to Port Arthur truth, they tend to be more likely to be found at the extreme ends of the list. 1 and 10 are far more likely to believe that there was more than one gunman than the middle section. I believe that this is because they are not particularly concerned about the spree killer himself, but are more concerned about the broad strokes. Based on my observations, they tend to be politically radical, and they hold contempt for authority. Politically speaking, there are some who identify as left-wing, but the overwhelming majority of them are conservative populists. They tend to be very involved in American politics and closely follow the MAGA campaign. They will decry big government censorship. We shall call this group the Radical Cluster.
To reiterate, this is a gradient, and it's not a one-to-one simplification. There are young people who believe that Blondie was entirely innocent, and older people who believe that he was assisted. Port Arthur truth is not a monolith. There are a diversity of opinions that generally cluster together. As they get progressively more radical, they get more wrong. These theories are full of contradictions. The timeline of events changes from person to person, along with the agreement of Blondie's involvement. I do not wish to concede any ground to the slightly more reasonable skeptics though. Remember, the halfway point between truth and a lie is not the truth.
I don't have time to go in and tell you how the Port Arthur massacre...
Something just hit me.
Huh? Out the wall?
I haven't talked about the Pentagon in this. Not the American Pentagon. So, this is going to be like a pretty free flow, and I'm just going to insert this in between chapters, I think. Alright, so, Port Arthur Truth has a lot of beliefs, but we've said little about what their actual arguments are. That's because Part 3 is dedicated to debunking, and I don't really want to be repeating myself too much. But I think it's important to note the 5 biggest beliefs of what it is that they say happened, right? Because otherwise I'm going to be accused of glossing over this. Note that we're going to talk about this at length in Part 3. Like, I imagine it's going to be over 2 hours. So just be patient and wait for that. So what I refer to as the Port Arthur Truth Pentagon. It's 5-sided, and these are all extremely important points. So, number 1, I have what I call the mental capacity argument. So they believe that someone of his mental capacity, an IQ of 66, very sort of autistic, not in a derogatory way, he was literally autistic, socially inept, someone like this wouldn't be able to plan out a multi-stage massacre. Which is false. He could do it, he could make plans, he traveled the world for God's sake. Number 2 is what I refer to as the 2 shooters MK Ultra argument. So basically, the 2 shooters argument is that Blondie may have committed some of the crimes, but he was assisted in the Broad Arrow Cafe specifically. So, Port Arthur Truthers will have the specific names of the people who they believe did this whole thing, and I'm planning on debunking that at length later on in this piece, because it's goddamn nonsense. Number 3 is what I refer to as the mortuary truck argument, which is the most esoteric point I think I've ever seen in a conspiracy theory. They think it's significant that the state of Tasmania owned a large mortuary truck in 1996. So they'll twist the narrative saying, oh, they bought this specially made mortuary truck mere weeks before the massacre, right? But it had been owned for several years before the massacre, and I have the documentation to prove it. Wait for it, okay? And even so, there are several reasons why the state would own a mortuary truck, a large one. Tasmania has shitloads of old people, for example. If a plane crash happened around Tasmania, you'd use a mortuary truck for that. It's just esoteric and I don't get it. Point 4 is what I refer to as the door argument. Did we have it there?
I don't think so.
We don't have it up there. Even though it's the most interesting point to me. So the door is sort of in reference to the historic site management being in on it. The souvenir shop, I think it's called the Gem Bar or something like that. When the souvenir shop, when the murders happened in there was a door, and it was sort of like an escape door, but it wasn't working. So Port Arthur truthers will say, aha, they locked that door on purpose so more people would die. And there's a very interesting backstory to that. And then the fifth part, and the most important part of the Port Arthur Truth Pentagon, is the hip headshots argument, which is up here. They believe that it's impossible for someone of Blondie's mental capacity to have gone around the Broad Arrow Cafe, shooting from the hip, shooting with his left hand, and getting exclusively headshots. And this is the hardest argument, because when you hear it in your brain, you're like, yeah, that sounds pretty not good. However, I'm going to debunk it thoroughly in the next episode. So these 5 points are incredibly important. We're going to come back to this Pentagon at length in episode 3 of this mini-series. So normally with conspiracy theories, you will often come across the alternate timeline. With 9/11 Truth, they allege the US government was working on training and setting up the plane attacks months in advance. This was not up to random chance. We have a progression of events that has been censored for public view, so that the evidence cannot be collected and certain individuals were far away from the attacks. Now, I've spent a really long time trying to wrap my head around the agreed upon timeline for Port Arthur Truth. I want to be able to explain it to you so that you can understand it, and it would be a very useful tool to refer back to for debunking purposes. But I can't refer back to it because there isn't one. When I say this, I do not mean that there are minor disagreements in the sequence of events, but there is no generally agreed upon sequence of events at all.
Let me repeat that.
But there is no generally agreed upon sequence of events at all. The conspiracy theory is so scrambled and scattered and frankly lazy that they do not know all of the information. This is highly unusual even by the standard of conspiracy theories. We have alternate versions of what happened at Broad Arrow and Seascape, but not in sequence. From my experience, when you ask a Port Arthur truther where the timeline differentiates from the main one, they can't answer you. They just crumble and they change the topic of conversation. They will talk about a specific point that, in their minds, count as contention. This is not a timeline. It is a pre-selected array of arguments, much like a weapons loader in a video game.
When one argument doesn't work, from my experience they will switch to another point, so that might convince you. When hip headshots is not self-explanatory, they will switch to the mortuary truck. When you ask them why it's important, and they cannot provide a succinct answer, they change the topic to who the gunman supposedly is. Individually, these arguments serve as what are called thought-terminating cliches. These are originally conceived in the context of totalist or cult systems, but they are very useful in understanding how certain types of conspiracy arguments work. According to Alexandria Stein, thought-terminating cliches are a kind of
loaded language that consists of group jargon, acts as verbal fetters, preventing followers from articulating anything, any thought or feeling outside of the bounds of what the group determines is acceptable.
This is not to imply that Port Arthur Truth is a cult, because it most certainly is not. It is far too disorganized in its organization or beliefs. But thought-terminating cliches are meant to function as the end of the conversation. When Pats claim that the state of Tasmania had a big mortuary truck, that in and of itself is proof of a conspiracy, and you are not supposed to question that, because, to them, you are simply defying logic. Because when you do, that might cause the Port Arthur truther to start being introspective about why such an innocuous thing matters so much. So, instead of that happening, they pivot to another talking point so that introspection cannot begin. This relates back to the timeline because this style of argumentation stalls the need for further details. This is a utility device to them. They can aggressively change the subject whenever it suits them. So this has one really good implicit advantage.
In his YouTube series, The Alt-Right Playbook, cultural critic and video essayist...
Wow, you got so mad that you cracked your finger.
Yeah, I broke it. Oh no! Cultural critic and video essayist Ian Danskin explores the development of the right-wing reactionary debating tactics. This style of aggressive posturing and switching positions can be described by what Danskin refers to as never playing defense.
The logic here is,
if they're always accusing, then you're always explaining. In all of these scenarios, who is doing all the explaining?
When coming across these arguments, you're more likely to remember the short and punchy explanations rather than the long paragraphs debunking them. The debunker is always reacting to the conspiracy theorist. Since they are always making short and sharp accusations, they feel dominant. They have not needed to flesh out the timeline yet because up to this point, there has not been any use in it. So, why the hell have I dedicated an entire chapter to a timeline that doesn't exist? That's a good question. Firstly, I think it's just completely absurd to proclaim someone's innocence if you cannot even concretely verify their whereabouts during the crime. Secondly, I have decided to piece together what I believe to be the strongest argument that they could come up with. I present this to you because I am trying to present this movement in a way that they themselves cannot articulate. It is usually not the job of the debunker to create the conspiracy theory for the theorist, but the Pat movement is just so disorganized and amateur that all of their quote-unquote experts have no qualifications to back up their claims, and they make little sense. From my observations, I have come across two major timelines that correlate with my observations with Cluster A and B, so I shall refer to them as Timeline A and B.
Cluster A argue that Blondie drove up to Roaring Beach on the morning of the 28th of April 1996 to go surfing. Their course of events aligned with the main timeline until Blondie pulled into Seascape at 11 AM. Roaring Beach is a 900-meter long beach about 10 kilometers west of the historic site. The evidence for the course of events is Blondie's own testimony. During the police interview that was shown in court, he claimed that he was at Roaring Beach surfing. According to this train of thought, you might wonder, how the hell did he end up in Seascape then? I mean, he ran out of the fire after all. Well, according to Port Arthur Truther Logic, Blondie testifies that he got involved at the toll booth, where he chanced upon a group of people. He claims that he asked nicely if he could borrow the driver's Rolls Royce. Then, he transferred all of his guns and ammo into it, because why wouldn't you be carrying weapons of war if you're just going to be going surfing? And the former occupants were killed after he drove away. Then, he randomly decided to kidnap Glenn Pears and take him hostage. Mysteriously, Mr. Pears' friend was killed. Somehow. After this, he retreated to Seascape. Here, he panicked and burned the Volvo and spontaneously decided to shoot hundreds of bullets at the police.
When I explain Timeline A like that, you will most likely conclude that that sounds bonkers. You might believe that I am just misrepresenting them to make a straw man. But in fact, I am doing the opposite. The absurdity of this sequence can only be understood when it is actually explained in sequence. This is an unbelievably unlikely sequence of events. It contradicts all eyewitness testimony and evidence found on site. Now, according to the same court transcript, Blondie can be observed lying several times. He denied seeing the Lanas for over a decade, which is false because he was harassing Miss Lana as she exited the Calvary Hospital outside his Clare Street home. And Roger Lana testified that Blondie showed up to his property just before the massacre. It's false!
Blondie also says to police, who knew well and truly where he was on the day, that he couldn't afford to get into the historic site, so therefore he couldn't have just... he couldn't have done the massacre.
Now this contradicts the fact that he bought coffee, petrol, tomato sauce, and a lighter on his way to the peninsula. He also paid for the toll booth fee to enter the site. He argued with Eileen Kingston, for God's sake. These are but a few of the lies he told police during the interview at Risdon Prison. This is an attempt to create a false alibi for himself, and it is unbelievably poorly conceived. No one else saw him at Roaring Beach or around the area, but hundreds of people saw him on the historic site. We know for a fact that while he was being interviewed, he did not have the character for telling the truth. Therefore, I do not believe much of anything Blondie said here that can be considered as serious evidence. Now, I have to touch on something before I move on. There is one incredibly interesting piece of information that was divulged here. That being the implication of where Blondie got his guns from. So, he claims to have gotten his weapons from Guns and Ammo in Newtown, a store operated by Mr. Hill. Remember, you needed to be a registered firearms user to own a weapon. You did not need to register each weapon you owned. If you wanted to buy a gun, you had to have a license. He found the ad in the Mercury and bought it from Mr. Hill weeks before the massacre. This claim was investigated and all the weapons were confiscated and his store was shut down. We have to include that their investigation came up with some serious evidence backing this up. Now, some Port Arthur truthers will claim that Mr. Hill was the second patsy in their theory.
They do claim to have one piece of evidence that completely exonerates Hill. Now, I will be examining this document in part 3 of this series, but suffice to say, it does not exonerate Hill in any way. In fact, this evidence actually works against them. Subscribe for that! Cluster B will put forth a different timeline that chronologically speaking makes more sense but is somehow more fantastical. Since they are a smaller group, it is difficult to nail down a specific timeline. From what I have gathered, they argue that multiple gunmen entered the Broad Arrow Cafe and started shooting civilians at will. While shooting civilians at will, they were not seen by anyone on site. They then got on a helicopter and were taken to Seascape Cottage, where they laid siege for 36 hours. They somehow escaped the cottage even though the police had it surrounded, and Blondie showed up at some point and copped the blame for the entire thing. So writing about this specific theory is difficult because when I explain what happened, I have to fix problems so that my sentences make sense. So a lot of assumptions have to be made to make this theory make sense. All first-hand survivors must be government shills because all of them deny that multiple gunmen were inside the cafe.
A lot of people came in afterwards, and a few of those people, for whatever motivation, came up with a different story.
They reckon, there was 2 gunmen and didn't do it, and the government set him up, and all this crap that was put out. It's all a load of bullshit because it was nothing like that. And I was in the middle of it.
And the first helicopters would not arrive for another hour. I'm sure survivors would have seen a helicopter if it had landed on site anywhere. But it didn't. The police and the forensics were in on it because they only found evidence of one gunman and no evidence of a helicopter. Personally, I do not believe that the multiple gunmen inside of Seascape theory is in any way imaginable. It is completely impossible to this case. So, Port Arthur truthers have a photo of this helicopter, but this proves nothing, and nonetheless, in this timeline, Blondie is still responsible for the ground killing, the toll booth murders, the petrol station, the road murders, and retreating back to Seascape. So as I have mentioned, Cluster B believed that Blondie is not innocent, but that the government blamed the entire event on him to hide their involvement, which, no! This is a monumental claim, which the only evidence for is a low-quality photo that proves nothing and spits in the face of a mountain of evidence. So where the multiple gunman theory becomes ever so slightly more possible, and remember 0.000001 times 0 is still 0, is the Seascape theory. So I plan to talk about that at length in the next episode, but suffice it to say right now, Pats believed that there were multiple gunmen at Seascape shooting at police.
I would like to point out that I think it's kind of funny that it makes no sense for government agents to be shooting at other government agents, but whatever. Only 3 bodies were found in Seascape, the Martins and Mr. Pears. No one else was in the building except for Blondie. These arguments that I have tried to explain for you require large gap filling on the part of the theorist. There are chasms that need to be navigated to justify logical conclusions. Port Arthur truth is about the broad strokes, and they completely disregard the gaps. This makes them incredibly difficult to argue against, because they have the advantage of not claiming to adhere to a specific chronology of events. This would be a clever rhetorical strategy if they were self-aware enough to recognize and take advantage of it. It is impossible to debunk a theory like this because it has such a liquid quality. To believe in something like this is incredibly difficult because you cannot rely on logical argument to back up your claims. You only have intuition and gut feelings to keep you going. It's difficult to argue with these people because they don't take you seriously. If you dare to argue with them, from my experience, you are likely just to be called a Freemason degenerate. Like, I'm not a Freemason. But I don't understand this particular insult. Am I part of an all-powerful cult, or am I degenerate scum not being worth taking seriously? Not all Port Arthur truthers are like this. I have just found one particularly funny exchange. But it is very interesting to me that when it comes to attacking someone's character, they are so quick to jump to calling you a degenerate. It shows what kind of person they think is not worth listening to. Danskin refers to this attack on character as the box strategy. The losing person puts you in a pre-established box, whether it be a delusional queer, me, brain-dead drone, or hostile government agent, also me. They craft these boxes so that when you start to make sense to them, the reactionary can say, nobody in that box is worth listening to. I do not excuse their bullshit arguments, but I simply want to point out their strategies so they might be cognizant of them and give them a chance to reflect. As people, they do not get this information from nowhere. So, where is it precisely that they get their arguments from? I wanted coffee. I'm tired. I know what you conspiracy theorists are thinking. There's nothing in there. Well, check this out. That's my ivermectin.
Grab a chucky. I'm a chucky boy.
Chucky boy. You see, John Howard, he gives me these if I'm a good boy and I debunk Paul Arthur truth. Thank you, Johnny. Jackboot Johnny.
Sawn off little dickhead Jackboot Johnny.
I don't know what Jackboot Johnny means, but I think it's hilarious.
I'll have to Google it afterwards.
What does it mean? Let's look it up.
A few moments later.
So jackboot, it's like a jackboot is like a thick military boot, right?
Okay, yep.
So it's like you're a militaristic sort of thing.
Yep.
And then number 2 underneath it, a common epithet used to conflate someone with Nazism. Okay, well, you know what? I've done a lot of research for this, but I did not know that. Fun. There's his face, and underneath it, I'm gonna put 2 boots. So it's gonna be like Gene from the Emoji Movie.
Hell yeah!
But John Howard.
Jackboot Johnny.
There are no prominent organizations protesting Blondie's arrest, to my knowledge. I found some evidence of petitions chasing after a royal commission into the massacre in the early 2000s, but that is the extent of conspiratorial government inquiry. So, when I first started researching this project, I just decided to look up Port Arthur Massacre Conspiracy into Google. Now, in between Reddit threads discussing the shooting from a historical perspective and articles about the 25th anniversary, I came across my very first destination, an open Facebook group titled Port Arthur The Truth. It is a most humble den of intelligent discourse, if I do say so myself. I came across this in several other communities focused on gathering what they perceive to be evidence to expose their version of the truth. Most of them are closed, but Port Arthur The Truth is open right now. It's a public group of just under 5,000 members. Now, I wrote that bit months ago, let me have a look. 5,300.
Okay,
so it's not that much.
Just over 5,000.
Here lies Cluster A. Here, they discuss perceived coincidences, they share very strange sources proving innocence, and they generally suck at spelling. They tend to mourn the loss of the life Blondie didn't get to live, instead of, I don't know, maybe the 35 men, women, and children who were murdered? Oh, that doesn't include all the people who were shot. So this group is somewhat self-contained, but it is part of a larger collective of different groups on Facebook. Several groups on Facebook tend to be interconnected. For example, Port Arthur Tasmania Exposed is 3 times its size, and it is much more organised.
Exposed is run by several members, but the most prominent one is Mr. Lloyd Vance.
He is an administrator, and based on his open Facebook profile, he has been a prolific conspiracy theorist for well over a decade. I mean, he just loves posting shit from Russia.
The members of this group regard Vance with a loving reverence, which I do not believe is unearned. I have observed many posts thanking Vance for checking in on members who have lost family, and he manages to somehow keep order within this very chaotic group.
I bring him up specifically because I found a Facebook page alleging that he's an ASIO agent trying to make Port Arthur Truth look bad.
In fact, the page has an even more interesting story. It seems that the main admin and Vance once ran a Port Arthur Truth group together. They seem to have had some kind of major falling out, and now the main admin has dedicated the past few years to slandering his name. In fact, he's gone to the trouble to make a fake account on leathermensdungeon.com just to upset him. It's good to know that Vance is a top, that's useful. Even if Vance was gay, his main problem here is that he's an avid Port Arthur Truther.
I think this is hilarious. This type of meta theory is not uncommon within conspiracy spaces.
Intimidating, paying off, murdering, or otherwise shutting up every conspiracy theorist who stumbles upon the incredible truth would presumably be fairly labour-intensive, the logic goes. It would be easier to discredit conspiracy movements from within, by actively spreading ever more convoluted, implausible, absurd theories, thereby manufacturing an atmosphere in which conspiracy theorists are invariably seen as unhinged whack jobs who aren't worth paying attention to.
There are plenty of reasons why this group is wrong. This does provide some anecdotal evidence about how paranoid some members of Port Arthur Truth are.
It was with this group that I was unfortunate enough to be introduced to Gumshoe News. This is supposed to be a news website, but I haven't found much evidence of that yet. Founded by Dee McLaughlin, a director, she directed a few episodes of Wentworth in 2014. She did a movie in 2007 about sex trafficking. It turns out she's also a massive conspiracy nut.
I'm Dee McLaughlin, and I'm usually behind the camera. I don't particularly want to be in front of it, but I am so full of the BS that we get from mainstream media and their inability to discuss the real questions that I feel we all need to speak out.
Excuse me, hello, I'm Mark. Oh, do you want booty? I'm Mark, yes, are you the booty hunters? Yes, Mark! Of course we are the booty hunters!
Gumshoe News posts every day about a variety of nonsense. Within the past year, they've had a real bee in their bonnet about COVID for some strange reason. Take this recent article released on May 25th, 2021.
Urgent! Doctors reconvene to discuss transmission issues to those not wanting the jabs.
It's barely an article. It's a collection of short sentences and an attached 2.5 hour long Zoom call with 5 doctors. These 5 doctors say that COVID-19 injections are bioweapons.
Jesus.
Okay then, let's do a basic Google search on these people since, they're doctors and all. They probably know more about this than me. Well, Dr. Sherry Tenpenny is a controversial anti-vax campaigner. Oh no. Well, I guess if she's controversial, that means she must have some kind of alternative expert opinion. I mean, okay, what are her qualifications? Like, what's her doctorate degree? What is it in? Virology? Is she some kind of pathologist? Maybe she's an epidemiologist. I mean, that could be constructive. But what about a chemist? Nope. Her doctorate is in osteopathy. I had heard about osteopathy before, but I didn't know what it was all about. So, I went to the Hobart Osteopath Clinic website, and according to them,
osteopaths are known for treating people with low back pain, neck pain, and headaches. But osteopaths also treat people suffering from sciatica, whiplash, and arthritis, as well as injuries to the joints of the arms and legs, including people with shoulder, hip, and knee pain.
From the website's About Osteopathy section,
osteopathy differs from other therapies in that it is not so much a treatment technique or a particular form of treatment, but more a philosophy that looks at the human being as a self-regulating, self-healing organism. A whole range of treatment techniques and approaches can then be drawn upon that endeavour to stimulate the body to heal and balance itself. The osteopath doesn't so much focus on the area of pain, but looks at the whole person to see why they are in pain and why the pain is manifesting in the way it is.
So they're kind of like a chiropractor, but they crack all of your bones in a spiritual way. Now, there's limited evidence to suggest that osteopathy really works. It is generally regarded as an alternative form of medicine, and it has received significant criticism from other doctoral professions. In Australia, we seem to have a higher quality of care within this realm than other countries such as the US. In fact, you can actually claim osteopathy on Medicare.
That's actually not correct. According to Google, osteopathic treatment is not usually covered by Medicare. The rebate only applies to patients who have a chronic or complex condition and have a referral for osteopathic treatment from their GP under a chronic disease management plan. It is important to remember that neither physiotherapists, chiropractors, nor osteopaths are doctors, and medical advice should always be sought from a qualified medical practitioner.
So knowing about a bunch of muscles and bones is all well and good if you have a headache, but it does not give one authority to make them an expert when it comes to vaccines, let alone COVID vaccines. In fact, there are several articles debunking this person's claims about vaccines. It is generally not a good sign when you look up a doctor online, and you first see several medical articles debunking their claims. Actually, that's wrong. It's medical opinions, not claims.
Next up is Dr. Carrie Maget. She believes that the COVID vaccine will alter your DNA.
Can I please get a citation there, please? Thank you.
Now, to quote Jack Goodman and Flora Carmichael writing for the BBC,
she also claims, without any evidence, that vaccines will hook us all up to an artificial intelligence interface.
Which is ludicrous. She has no peer-reviewed studies under her belt. She is expressing her own medical opinion, which is ridiculously wrong. The authors also write as a response,
there are 25 different candidate vaccines in clinical trials around the world according to the World Health Organization, but none of them will alter human DNA, and they do not contain technology to link people up to an artificial intelligence interface.
Dr. Maget got a doctorate from the Kansas City of Medicine Bioscience College of Osteopathic Medicine. Again, she's outside of her field of expertise, and she relies heavily upon her own personal opinion. Her credentials do not make her an authority on this topic.
The third one is Lawrence Palevsky. He isn't an osteopath. Well, that's a nice change. He does believe that vaccines cause autism, though. Oh no. He directly cites former Dr. Andrew Wakefield, the man infamous for manufacturing the MMR scare. Oh boy.
Credited the doctor who convinced thousands of parents to skip vital vaccinations for their children. Andrew Wakefield's already been stripped of his medical licence. Now he's been called a fraud.
Wakefield was a gastroenterologist, and according to journalist Brian,
he wasn't a virologist, immunologist, epidemiologist, or any kind of ologist to render his opinion admissible on such matters in court.
The court that Deere references was the General Medical Council hearing, a 217-day-long trial that took place over 3 years.
Despite having supporters, the UK medical profession's watchdog, the General Medical Council, stripped him of his medical licence last year, calling him dishonest and irresponsible.
The doctor who sparked the scare over the safety of the MMR vaccine for children changed and misreported results in his research, creating the appearance of a possible link with autism. Confidential medical documents and interviews with witnesses have established that Andrew Wakefield manipulated patients' data, which triggered fears that the MMR triple vaccine to protect against measles, mumps, and rubella was linked to the condition.
Further, there are meta-studies done on thousands of children that have not found a link between vaccines and autism. If you are interested in this topic, I have linked a really interesting video by known moon criminal H. Bomber Guy. And, even if vaccines did cause autism, I would still rather have autism than polio or die. Therefore, I feel strongly that autism is not the be-all end-all of human life. I just make an 8-hour-long documentary on conspiracy theories. That's all autism is. Anyway, off track. This is a false claim from an otherwise normal-seeming doctor. In fact, when I actually looked up his credentials, I found this article. According to Insider Magazine, J.K. Trotter writes that
there are, however, certain discrepancies in his professional history. The website of Palevsky's clinic repeatedly describes him as a board-certified pediatrician. That status is conferred by the American Board of Pediatrics, which continually tests pediatricians to ensure they have up-to-date training and expertise in the field. But a representative for the board told Insider Magazine that Palevsky's most recent certification expired at the end of 2014.
Palevsky isn't even a doctor anymore. That's why I didn't call him a doctor in the beginning, because that would be a lie, and I would never lie to you. So, even if he was a qualified doctor in the 90s, that still wouldn't make him an expert on vaccines. He is speculating about a field in which he has no specialties in.
Dr. Lee Marie is an orthopedic surgeon. She's a spine doctor. She's not an osteopath, but she's a dead-set spine doctor. That is awesome. Shame is still not relevant to the use of COVID vaccines, but at the very least, she's a real doctor.
In fact, she's a part of America's frontline doctors, which sounds excellent. This is clearly not some non-partisan medical organization one could be part of. According to award-winning chemist and author Joseph Schwartz, writing for McGill University,
Marie also believes in a conspiracy by the Illuminati to destroy the world with abortion, gay marriage, and of all things, children's toys. As far as gynecological diseases go, they can be caused by having sex with witches and demons that appear in dreams.
Her claims have very little merit for someone with 2 R's and 2 T's in her name. That was worth it.
Finally, we have Dr. Christine Northrup. She is a gynecologist. Unless the vaccine is administered right into the vagina, I can't imagine that there would be much relevant expertise that she could bring to the table here. She is the author of The Wisdom of Menopause, and is also a New Age spiritualist. Jonathan Jarry, a biologist with a specialization in DNA technology, writes for McGill University that
rarely have I witnessed such a smorgasbord of gobbledygook from someone who once had an active medical license. She does not believe vaccines are necessary if your body is healthy and has spread unsubstantiated fears about safe vaccines throughout her career. She has claimed that the COVID-19 vaccines will target specific chromosomes that act as the seat of our empathy, an utterly absurd and unscientific statement. She believes that artificial intelligence has somehow been incorporated into these vaccines, complete nonsense, and that this AI will integrate itself into our DNA. She warns her viewers that the injection of patented vaccines inside our body will turn us into the property of the patent holders. Funny how I've not heard her say the same for artificial heart valves, pacemakers, and insulin pumps.
She also delves into multiple other conspiracy theories and has been a public supporter of QAnon. Repeat after me, everyone. Something sweeping claims that are outside of her field of expertise.
Let's be frank. None of these people are qualified to be talking about vaccines in the first place. They are not biologists, chemists, virologists, or epidemiologists. In science, we are supposed to use evidence to justify our conclusions. Some of these people are doctors, and they flail their credentials about, justifying their preconceived conclusions based on zero evidence. These people are all unqualified grifters who make money off of anxious people with their unsubstantiated claims, in my opinion. These fields of study have nothing to do with vaccines, so when Gumshoe News calls these people credible, they cannot be taken seriously. It took me half an hour of research to come to that conclusion. It would be wrong to assume Gumshoe News is acting in good faith here. These 5 people were chosen because they fit a preconceived narrative that Gumshoe News is trying to get across. So when I also point out that this is the most consistent Port Arthur Truther website, you must understand what I'm talking about here. This source has absolutely no credibility. It's run by a movie director, for God's sake. What the hell does she know about journalism? Okay, let's take a look at 2 of their articles on the topic, both written on the 25th anniversary of the massacre. This means that they have had 25 years to reflect on the evidence and craft the best arguments possible.
A Young Person's Guide is written by Malcolm Hughes. Mal, as he likes to be referred to, is a prolific Port Arthur truther. In fact, his work is in the Tasmanian Library, and a decade after his material was put into the library, he wrote this wonderful article titled A Young Person's Guide to the Port Arthur Massacre, Mal Hughes passes the torch. The introduction describes the article as unusual, but not because it is full of conspiratorial nonsense. No. But because it is structured as something like a Socratic dialogue. We are supposed to picture Mal wearing a toga and sitting down next to an ignorant youth and then enlightening them about their history. But it's just incredibly obvious that he made the whole thing up. The millennial, who is just comically ignorant about contemporary politics, doesn't even seem to know what a Port Arthur even is. The millennial never so much as challenges a single claim Mal makes, and let me tell you, right off the bat he says Blondie is completely innocent, so you can only imagine how wild the rest of the article gets. This is what political philosophers call constructing a public. He is crafting an ignorant younger generation, ignorant to their own history, and if this public were to know about this information, they would readily believe it. Mal wants the reader to think that normal, everyday people would certainly see through the government's lies, thus making him sound significantly less strange.
But okay, let's give the benefit of the doubt and let's assume that this is an honest-to-God conversation. Mal recreates the conversation word for word, down to the stutters. Surely that means that he's been secretly recording this person. That's illegal, right, Joel? You do law.
It depends.
It depends on? If you're just like a private citizen and you go into a pub and you record a conversation just to publish online.
I mean, you'd hope there'd be consent.
Fuck! No! I got coffee all over my fucking beard. Ugh, it's already gross enough. I certainly hope that Mal didn't go about secretly recording his pub conversations with random millennials. Despite knowing so much about the massacre, he gets the basics of the timeline wrong. He references Blondie's photo being on the front page a day after the massacre, it was 2 days, and shows a photo that was certainly not on the front page at all. This piece does not prove anything, and it simply waffles along to fill out the word count for this very real conversation. Mal also manages to plug Gumshoe News twice during this casual conversation with this very real millennial, a human person who constantly uses words like crikey and geez. I mean, big oof. Press F. This ain't it, Chief. Yikes. Avocado toast. How do I click the book? Don't worry, Mal. You'll get a participation trophy for attempting to talk to the younger generation.
25 Years After was released on the 25th anniversary of the massacre. How tasteful! It does not bring forth any new ideas, but instead it is a summary of several different articles on the website. These take the form of several short vignettes. So, we can get a taster of several different articles and get a feel for the different perspective that Gumshoe News brings to the table. Well, firstly, this vignette claims to have a devastating source, proving that something fishy happened at Port Arthur. Oh my! Well, I guess we better have a look at this source, since it could be very important.
D. McLaughlin, the owner of the website and the director, writes that fellow theorist Stuart Beattie wrote to Terry Schultz that his friend, Tony Caitlin, heard from an unnamed friend in the Australian Federal Police, who several weeks after the massacre heard via an unnamed third party in a public cemetery about a random citizen-banned radio broadcast, allegedly from Tasmania Police, in which a voice is heard responding to the request to shoot with "Permission denied, this has to happen." This is one of the biggest games of Chinese whispers I've ever played in my entire life. This is a major talking point in the article. Further, despite there being 6 degrees of separation in this claim, not one of the people making it can provide any substantial evidence to support it. No one recorded it, nor do they provide any of the context leading up to the supposed utterance. This is the very definition of hearsay.
Eagle-eyed viewers might have noticed that this article actually posts a link for a source, which is actually pretty rare and great. So I thought I would save you the click and the potential adware you might get by looking at it myself. And get this, they literally cite themselves as a source. This is not an authoritative transcript, but it's another article that is repeated word for word. They copied and pasted their own claim and used that as a source. You can't make this up, this is pathetic. The second vignette is not an article at all, but rather a thinly veiled ad for a book. Stuart Beattie, a theorist with no credentials related to the topic, wrote a book called A Gunman's Notebook for Port Arthur. And look, I'll just say, I've read every book about this topic, take my word for it, it's not good. Mary here simply says, it's good, that's all. I wish I had more to say about it. Why did I read this book? I spoke for 5 pages about this vaccine thing and I can't even muster a word to talk about gunsmiths. It's baseless, but according to this recommendation, it's great. Seriously though, don't buy it. If you have to satisfy your craving, there exists a PDF online that you can read. It sucks. The third vignette is a copy-paste from the millennial... Geez, they really couldn't bring up many points for this summary. 25th anniversary, the perfect time to bring up the best possible arguments, am I right? Nope, let's just redo copy-paste, that's hard. The fourth vignette is about survivor Wendy Skerr, with an alleged email written to another member of the Gumshoe community about the true nature of what happened in the Macaque household before the massacre. You might remember Wendy Skerr as the woman who called police during the massacre. At the point of this being written, Wendy Skerr was one of the most prolific conspiracy theorists, and she had an aura of credibility because she was there on the day. Now, I plan to speak about Skerr at length in part 3, so I won't dwell on it too long here, but at this point, she'd already spoken out against the historic site management and the government. So why would she only choose to speak out about this mysterious incident in 2016? However, I do want to take her claims seriously and not blow them out of proportion. So, we will leave it at that for now.
This was but one website. I have gained nothing of substance beyond a mysterious headache. Maybe that's the mind control I've been reading so much about. Oh no! I'm feeling compelled to look at another Port Arthur Truth website! The Phaser is a nonsense site that tells you to stun them with the truth. Bold claim! What reasonable articles do they have on their front page?
Global genocide has always been their stated goal.
Dollar demise. The end of the dollar is just one announcement away.
India's silver demand returns at massive levels?
This is an act of war against us all.
You mainly find reposted links to Gumshoe News. Good, including this one. So this is one of the first Port Arthur Truther documentaries I came across in my research.
It appears both the state and defence tried to coerce to admit guilt, but he insisted that he had not visited the historic site for 6 years. Was he capable of shooting so many people so quickly with such efficiency? emulating the skills of a trained marksman.
A channel referred to as Gumshoe News filmed their TV because they couldn't figure out how to download video or screen record. It's really weird and unconvincing. I can't figure out who the voiceover is.
Yeah, so while I was editing this, I realized that voice that I couldn't figure out was D. McLaughlin. Makes sense, it's the Gumshoe News website. And also, I can't imagine there are too many South African Port Arthur truthers out there, at least high profile enough to narrate a shit YouTube video like this. Anyway.
It just hurts my brain. I'm going to look away now. I wonder what happens if I scroll to the bottom of their site.
Thephaser.com assumes all information to be truthful and reliable. However, information at thephaser.com is not to be construed as investment advice. The content on this site is provided without any warranty, express or implied. The commentary on thephaser.com reflects the opinions of thephaser.com and other contributing authors. Perform your own due diligence before buying or selling any investments, securities, or precious metals. Actions you want to take as a consequence of any analysis, opinion, or advertisement on this site are your sole responsibility.
What happened here? Who sued them? Over their metal opinions? Some poor boomer probably spent their entire super fund on this bogus advice. In my opinion, of course. I don't want to get sued by the freedom warriors over at the Phaser. And speaking of freedom, there's no place quite like far north Queensland. Cairns News is your one-stop shop for the People Power News Service. It's also a politically incorrect zone, and they also claim all personnel entering these premises will encounter a thing called freedom of speech. That's great, because that means I don't have to worry about being sued, since of course they'll respect my right to criticize their website and organization. I can say whatever I want. Hooray! This is a grifter website that wants your money. They leech off of other people's Port Arthur conspiracy research, and they pack it up in bullshit articles and woeful formatting. Their website looks like it was designed with Microsoft Paint. In regard to Port Arthur, they have loads of bunk. I wouldn't exactly call it news.
But I ain't spending any time on it, because in the meantime, every 3 months, a person is torn to pieces by a crocodile in North Queensland.
Here's a Port Arthur article. For some reason, they're taking the sarcastic route to debunking the main timeline. You can't quite tell how serious they're being. They go from claiming Blondie got the morgue truck himself that transported the bodies for the government to claiming that he had infrared night vision eyes.
So what they're doing is they're arguing that Blondie himself must have caused all of the coincidences behind the massacre. But that doesn't make any sense, and not in the way that the article means. They seem to be trying to cultivate a feeling here. You see the obvious lies being presented to you, and then the authors want to transfer that feeling to the government response as a whole. It's bizarre. It's the same bunch of points over and over again, no new arguments presented, and the same points are wrong in the same ways from other websites. It honestly feels like they've just copied and pasted these points from previous sites and rearranged the words a little bit so that the audience doesn't notice.
And before you wonder whether this is meant to be purely satirical, the comments of this piece can easily dissuade you of that notion, with plenty of folks unabashedly believing anything the site tells them. They seem to ignore the jerky element of the piece, which is incredibly difficult to do since it claims Blondie wore a mask with his own face on it to look like he had acne. This is silly. Let's check a different article just to be safe.
Channel 7 clearly being managed by Deep State after unbelievable Port Arthur segment.
I don't think it's that clear, actually. This is a reshared video, and the article attached is about an entirely different news piece. I will be speaking about this piece at length later, but they say that the Deep State has an alleged child trafficking ring operating out of Canberra. Citation needed, please!
The only way to understand the Port Arthur incident is to cease accepting the official narrative as the truth, the whole truth. Every significant fact has to be assessed with an objectivity which does not have as its motive the setting up of a patsy, but which is motivated by the need for undeniable truth. We must, in Roger Bacon's words, resist weak and unworthy authority, long-standing custom, the feeling of the ignorant crowd, and the hiding of our own ignorance, all of which send us back to the official narrative. As soon as your truth torch lights up,
you will say Blondie is innocent.
Who else would have a motive to run such a slanderous piece? I agree, Jim O'Toole. Who would say something as ridiculous as that? The Millennium Report is here to save the day. Oh no! They believe that the 2020 bushfires were a Jewish government conspiracy to push climate change agenda. Oh, they're too far gone, and my brain is too small for their dark truth. Oh, speak of the devil. The dark truth is the most anti-Semitic thing I've seen in a while. Big ol' content warning.
So it begins with 17 questions that the author has for authorities, and in fact, every single one of them is complete nonsense. Many contain outright lies and absolutely outrageous claims without a single source to back them up. They range from the state owning a big mortuary truck, to so what, to incorrect assertions like the historic site management going up to the East Coast, it was the West Coast, it was the Strawn Conference, to claiming that the police gathered no DNA evidence at all. Now, that's not true, and I will be covering all 17 of these points in part 3, but rare is it that I see someone write so confidently and so incorrectly.
This article concludes that after 17 points of waffling on about easily debunkable points and coincidences, that Howard was a liberal who panders to Australia's 140,000 Jews. Rupert Murdoch, who controls the newspapers, put him in power. Jews have always wanted a gun ban. Howard rushed the most draconian one in history through in 2 weeks. First of all, it was 6 weeks. Second of all, Rupert Murdoch isn't Jewish. This is a fringe wacko conspiracy website, and it is shared all of the time in these Port Arthur groups. I'm not cherry picking here to make them look bad. This article is reposted every other week.
In fact, it is also referenced on a few conspiracy podcasts. Those conspiracy guys refers to it as a totally legit source that checks all its information, which, no, it's not! I cannot reiterate enough how much this article has influenced Port Arthur Truth. In fact, I would go as far to say that it is foundational and essential reading for the community, which is very concerning. So it's about time that I finally brought it up.
Yeah. It is impossible to talk about conspiracy theories without mentioning anti-Semitism somewhere. The two have a deep historical connection to each other. Likewise, it is nigh impossible to give a brief, succinct history of what anti-Semitism is and how it came to be. I've tried that, and trust me, it ruined the flow of this video. I had to delete 5 pages from the script. I can turn that into its own video. Comment below if you want that video, because I read way too much. Port Arthur Truth believed that there is a vague and nebulous them, generally an NWO-style group, wanted to make the Australian populace complacent, unable to fight back against any number of totalitarian policies. Now, we cannot ignore the fact that no such totalitarian policies have come in the past 25 years since Port Arthur. At least not to people who are white. Their proclamations of freedom of speech and property often have a strong resistance to any non-white folk who want the same things. This kind of populist movement is not about universal rights, but about their rights personally. We plan to explore this point in Chapter 6, but for now, we have to understand that this movement is reactionary. They want a certain law to be reversed, and they need some kind of scapegoat to justify their beliefs. So, does Port Arthur Truth hate Jewish people intrinsically? Well, Blondie certainly did, and a lot of its members do. From this, I can only conclude that in this community there is at least a casual indifference to anti-Semitism. The community might not uniformly be hostile to Jewish people, but they're okay with anti-Semitic claims. And I do not want to just stop there. It's not constructive to just point and say, aha, an anti-Semitism, and leave it there. Because we already know that this movement is not woke. Like, oh man, we're really gonna have to cancel Port Arthur Truth for being toxic and manipulative. Instead, I want to dig deeper and take this as an opportunity to explore why anti-Semitism is so prevalent in conspiracy spaces. Let's take this as an educational point instead of a point to just get mad about. I wanted to learn more about anti-Semitism in Tasmania specifically, so I decided to go to the Hobart Synagogue. And then we're gonna fade away.
Tasmania is not only home to the oldest synagogue in Australia, but also one of the oldest continuously running synagogues in the Southern Hemisphere. Tasmania has a congregation of just under 600 Jewish people. They don't have a rabbi, so services are conducted by the members. They describe themselves as a very DIY crew, and I found the tour that Joel and I took to be completely and utterly fascinating. We asked why the architecture of Temple House looked the way it did. When the building was being designed and built in 1825, Egyptian revivalism was a big thing in the British colonies. Everyone wanted their buildings to look like Napoleon would invade them. The building was consecrated in 1845, and ever since, Judaism has been practiced within these walls. We met David, and he was very kind and receptive to our questions. He enthusiastically explained the history of Tasmanian Judaism to us. Tasmania's first Jews came in chains. Out of 17, 16 were prisoners. You might wonder why the Dark Truth and Port Arthur Truth in general believe that there is some kind of plot against them. Well, it's because Jewish people aren't really people to the conspiracy theorist. Conspiracy theories about Jewish people have crafted the very language that we use to discuss conspiracy theories. There are two key historical events that were important for our contemporary concept of anti-Semitism. The first started way back in 1894 with the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, otherwise known as the Dreyfus Affair. This trial was a French media sensation, comparable to the O.J. Simpson trial, and like how that trial was symbolic of race relations in 1990s America, to properly understand the importance of this trial, we must first understand that the French Revolution increased the rights of French Jews significantly.
Birthplace of Jewish emancipation in Europe, the home of the Great Revolution, and the Declaration of the Rights of Man.
So France had a reputation of being enlightened and tolerant. At the same time, religious factions resented the French state for its secularization. Atheism itself was often considered to be of Jewish origins, since it rejected Christ.
It is worth repeating that Jews and Judaism were not the central concerns of the French Revolution. Nor does the work done by models of supersession and conversion in revolutionary thought fully explain the revolution's increasingly total attempt to transform the world and its itinerary toward terror. I have stressed that the Christian supersession of Judaism is translated into Jacobin ideas of revolution, not because I take this translation to be of paramount importance to the history of the French Revolution, but because it is an excellent example of how ideas about Jews, Judaism, and Judaism could underlay revolutionary thought. Although the revolution sometimes thought of themselves as revolting against Judaism, they rarely attacked real Jews.
Which for Europe in the 1800s is one hell of an achievement. So, when a French spy caught a letter trying to sell military secrets to Germany, and the investigation into this letter led to Richard Dreyfus, an officer whose only perceived wrongdoing was being a Jewish soldier, the press had an absolute field day. No, years! Dreyfus was later found completely innocent, and to summarize the entire affair would take me a very long time, and although it features as many plot twists as the Simpson trial, I will link to some documentaries below for the curious. Suffice to say, Dreyfus pleaded not guilty, and those representing him uncovered massive French corruption. It also led to widespread violence directed at completely unrelated French Jews.
In 1895, the peak year of the Dreyfus Affair, there were also small-scale anti-Semitic riots in most of the largest French cities, including Paris, Marseille, Lyon, Nantes, Rennes, Tours, Bordeaux, and Clermont-Ferrand. The cry "Death to the Jews" swept France, and for a few months it appears as one of the most popular weapons in the arsenal of those in the army, the church, and ultranationalist circles who hoped to overthrow the Republic.
France's right-wing press disregarded all the revelations of corruption, believing that the innocence claims were further proof of conspiracy. This split the French public into two factions, those who believed Dreyfus was guilty, and the correct people. Again, the only point of blame he had against him was that he was Jewish.
Antisemitism, though temporarily marginalised, nonetheless remained a vehicle for all kinds of grievances and discontent in French society, which would resurface between the wars. Politically heterogeneous, it could appear as both radical and conservative, royalist and republican, anti-capitalist and anti-Marxist. Above all, as the founder of Integral Nationalism and Boulanger's deputy Maurice Barre put in 1889, it offered a national union against the alien cosmopolitan Jews, which cut across the division of social classes.
This mobilization of political forces in solidarity against Jewish people would prove to be an unfortunately popular rallying cry in the next 50 years. People wonder why the French military happily helped the Nazis track down so many French Jews. Events like the Dreyfus Affair had long-lasting effects.
The second event was the publishing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Now this is a blatantly false book, claiming to be the leaked document of a Jewish cabal controlling the world, somewhere, somehow. It was found to be blatant forgery of another book. Nevertheless, it didn't stop pogroms from taking place all across Europe. Henry Ford famously distributed copies of the Protocols because he believed the Jews were controlling the markets. The unifying power of anti-Semitism is such that the man who exploited your labour for his own wealth can convince you and all of your co-workers that it was some random Jew's fault that you were poor and miserable. The Protocols formed a sort of blueprint for how we view the nebulous cabal of evildoers, off in some room somewhere doing an evil. So to quote Hannah Arendt on the topic of Nazis, in The Origins of Totalitarianism,
Nazi propaganda was ingenious enough to transform anti-Semitism into a principle of self-definition, and thus to eliminate it from fluctuations of mere opinion. It used the persuasion of mass demagogy only as a preparatory step and never overestimated its lasting influence, whether in oratory or in print. This gave the masses of atomized, undefinable, unstable, and futile individuals a means of self-definition and identification which not only restored some of the self-respect they formerly derived from their function in society, but also created a kind of spurious stability which made them better candidates for an organization.
So according to Arendt, the use of the term scapegoat is too simplistic. A scapegoat solves one issue for a limited amount of time. When a movement needs a perpetual enemy to continuously justify adherence, they blame a global cabal of cartoonish evildoers who are behind the whole thing. Pats do not always believe that the Howard government is behind the incident, but a sinister New World Order has secretly been pulling the strings all along. So why is this precisely? Well, conspiracy theorists struggle to articulate a precise reasons for such international japes. So as previously mentioned, theorists will say that the globalists, which is just a dog whistle for Jewish people, are trying to control us, to enforce conformity and to keep the masses complacent. These tactics have been used to blame Jewish people for millennia. The anti-Semite needs the Jewish person to understand his worldview. At the core of anti-Semitism lies an important concept in conspiracy theory discourse: emotional truth. So this is a phenomenological value statement. Someone is a wanker. That is philosophy jargon for what feels to be true in your body. So I plan to discuss the bodily sensation of truth at length in part 4 of this mini-series. But for now, we must understand that reality is not the primary concern of the anti-Semite.
Jewish people are one of, if not, the oldest continuously persecuted minorities in recorded human history. Very few Jewish people have held any modicum of power during that time. The claim that Jewish people, as a whole, hold some kind of nebulous power is foolish at best. Anti-Semitism cannot stop inequality, but the powerful recognize it as a very useful tool to distract the masses from their power. Think back to Henry Ford. It does not matter if he genuinely believed the protocols, because his mass publishing allowed him to keep his wealth and power. It felt emotionally true that a small minority could control the world. We don't like to accept the world as chaotic and unfair, so we manifest all of these uncomfortable realities onto a perpetual scapegoat.
Okay, so why am I talking about this so suddenly? Well, it has everything to do with the reason this entire conspiracy movement exists. If this really happened, what goal would the Australian government hope to achieve with such a massive false flag attack? The only way that this conspiracy theory can exist is in that anti-Semitic context. You have to have an NWO-style group controlling everything from the top. The desire to believe the theory comes before the evidence. This particular conspiracy theory stands to be their sole justification for their entire worldview. If this conspiracy is true, therefore everything else can be true. In my opinion, this is because Australia's gun reform is consistently cited every time a mass shooting happens in America. So, we have these radical skeptics who have a need to discredit Australia's gun control system. Therefore, they have to question the massacre. Delegitimize the massacre, you delegitimize gun control. Cluster B, the radicals, are closely associated with QAnon, and they swim freely between conspiracy theories. The sympathetic cluster will generally limit their theorizing to John Howard's administration orchestrating the attack. So, it is important that these Port Arthur truthers are critically and precisely corrected. There are most certainly people with what you could describe as pure intentions in Port Arthur truth. They truly believe Blondie's innocence, and are, just to say, misguided. So you might say, okay, that might be a valid reason to be concerned, but why is it that you care so much? Immediately, I am interested in the psychology of the conspiracy theorist, and I think that Port Arthur truth makes for an interesting and somewhat sincere case study. But this conspiracy is at a very interesting stage of development. They are just small enough that most haven't taken notice of them yet, but they are growing bolder. So as I mentioned in the previous chapter, PATs are secretive, so I find it interesting when they start to launch targeted brigades against people who speak out against them. I believe that is significant. More on that later. Their sense of validation does not come from the evidence that they attempt to collect, it is not empirical, but from the constant validation they receive from these communities. They share the same set of sources from the same handful of websites that cite the same poorly researched or boldly false articles. It is the repetition they crave. If they stop sharing these sources, reason may begin to creep into their heads. They must keep trying to convince themselves that they are free thinkers and societal rebels, questioning the truth. This explains the aggressive colonization of even mildly critical sources. Go anywhere online that talks about the Port Arthur Massacre. You'll see these people underneath in the comment sections being like, yeah, the government's bad! For example, there was that episode of Media Watch from 1996. You know, the one that explicitly criticizes the Murdoch media for glorifying the events. They cite this as evidence of media conspiracy, a text that directly says that Blondie did it and deserved a fair trial. They will ignore what they don't like and project their own meaning onto it.
Part 2, Chapter 5, Take 1.
Oh, jeez! It's okay, there's a light there. We said shit's getting deranged around here.
Are you ready to keep going?
I've made such a mess on this desk. So, imagine, if you will, you observe a group like this, flailing about in all directions, searching for anything that can be considered validation. If you were economically savvy, you could make some serious money off of these people. Here, Port Arthur Truth is a small and passionate market from which you could reap rewards from.
Game is on.
This is because they repeatedly view the same sources. They are an audience that maximize attention and retention. Now, retention is a fancy word meaning engagement. The more times a consumer clicks on the website and the more ads they see means the more profit generated from the ads on your website. This is the reason why all these articles have such sensationalist headlines. This is because they are essentially politically themed clickbait. In Post-Truth, Lee McIntyre argues that for as long as there has been news, there has been fake news.
Fake news continued down through the ages, even during the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. Just before the French Revolution, a number of pamphlets appeared in Paris recounting the near bankruptcy of the government. These were put out, however, by rival political factions who used different numbers and blamed different people.
There is a long history of people wanting to push their agenda by misinforming the public, and clickbait has existed as long as the internet. Early social media was full of sensationalist headlines and an uncritical audience ready for seduction. But these articles were evaluated after consumption. McIntyre says that
fake news is not simply news that is false, it is deliberately false. It has been created for a purpose. At the beginning of the 2016 election season, they wanted you to click on a provocative headline so that you would add a few cents to their coffers. Creators of fake news articles began to notice that favourable stories about Trump were getting many more clicks than the favourable ones about Hillary, and the negative stories about Hillary were getting the most clicks of all. So guess which ones they doubled down on.
It doesn't seem quite as odd now why Gumshoe News keeps referencing itself in what is supposedly a real-world scenario. Unique traffic to the website will be told that Gumshoe are paragons of free speech, as well as knowing the truths of the matter. In reading one article, a person is then led to many more. The more clicks, the more page views, the more ad views, the more money for Gumshoes. Hey, that rhymes! The Port Arthur angle does not only stop at these websites, they also have a small range of conspiracy authors, notable ones like Stuart Beattie and Joe Viles. Joe! Who write extensively and without qualification about what they think actually happened. Now, it is up for debate about how seriously they believe in their work. Viles, who I will talk about extensively later, came across as nothing if not passionate. But it is hard to deny that these authors are, without a doubt, financially motivated to sell their books. If they come across new evidence that contradicts their views, they are quite unlikely to change their position. I am reminded of political writer Upton Sinclair, when he said that it is difficult for a man to believe something when his salary depends upon him not believing it. People like this are not explicitly grifters. They are passionate fans who make their own merch and they sell it to other fans. Removed from all political and moral connotations, it's kind of cute. But more than anything, I feel a sense of secondhand embarrassment, a kind of schadenfreude. It's like seeing those blokes who put like sex signifiers on the back of their utes. You think of them as wankers for being outrageously confident in something that's so cringeworthy. You wonder, why would someone ruin their expensive car over something so odd? And in these groups as well, you can find links to personalised cups and posters proclaiming Blondie's innocence. You know what? You can ruin your family Christmas party for the low price of only $50. You're not going to believe this, but there is no major company selling Port Arthur Truth merch. It's not like an InfoWars situation, where the host plugs their merch after every commercial break, as it would lead to economic suicide to plug Port Arthur Truth merch in Australia. This is not to say that Australia doesn't have freedom of speech, but it is simple market logic that no reasonable business would want to be associated with such a movement. That is not the case in other countries. One of the more devastating spree shootings of the past 5 years was the Christchurch mosque massacres, in which an Australian gunman entered 2 New Zealand mosques and killed over 60 people. I remember the day this happened because unwillingly, I watched the live stream. I had been keeping my eye on conspiracy groups for a couple of years at that point, and it is not surprising that these groups are also the easiest places online to see this footage. Because of this massacre, the Ardern-led New Zealand government pushed for Australian-style gun control laws. Now, I cannot comment too much on the situation in New Zealand, because 1, I do not entirely understand the cultural differences between our 2 countries, and 2, the most I know about New Zealand are what Taika Waititi and Peter Jackson have told me, and therefore I do not feel like I have the strongest position to speak about their policy. However, what I do wish to comment on is that one of the largest subgroups of Port Arthur Truth are New Zealanders. I think he's innocent, bro.
In a post-Trump world, the call for New Zealand gun control sparked a hell of a lot of conspiracy talk. Quite blatantly, the shooter was an eco-fascist with deep ties to the alt-right. He had been radicalized online and believed that the only way to stop climate change was to annihilate all non-white people. There is no debunking this because it is monumentally wrong. We all know the motivations of the spree killer, so why do they doubt him when he had such self-evident motivations? I feel like I would have to go deeper into this conspiracy theory, more so than I already have to come up with a concrete answer for you. But suffice to say, these conspiracy theorists became Port Arthur truthers to debunk the claims that Australian gun control works. Most of the New Zealand contingent are in the form of podcasts on YouTube and Spotify. Now, it is difficult to research these sources because most of them ended up falling down the QAnon rabbit hole, and thus their YouTube channels got deleted. Those who remain are perhaps the most accessible pathways into Port Arthur Truth. They already had the infrastructure, the interconnectedness, and the reach that matches YouTube's algorithm. Their videos are far more aesthetically pleasing than most of the ground roots Port Arthur Truth videos I've come across. Their production values are higher, and they do not just look like they've filmed their TV and are using Windows Movie Maker circa 2007. The arguments of the New Zealand contingent still rely upon the same weapons loadout logic of the movement. They have not evolved upon the ideas themselves, but they have sophisticated the spread.
They have less cultural understanding of what made Port Arthur significant. And speaking of a lack of cultural understanding, the Spanish play! Oh no!
Go on like this.
I need a hammer. Where'd it go? Found it. No, I didn't. That's just the head. I'm just gonna put a hair clip. The Spanish play. So, this isn't important. Port Arthur Truth doesn't know about this. Or at least not many of them. And nor do many of them speak Spanish. I don't think any of them do. But this has to be the funniest Port Arthur Truth adjacent content I've come across in my research. Ready? It's a Port Arthur Truth play.
Es que si no está mi abogado delante...
Ya le hemos dicho a otro abogado que íbamos a hablar contigo.
Sí, y no ha puesto ningún problema, ¿eh? Así que, ¿qué hay de malo en que hables con nosotros?
Well, it's not really, but it is. So the play is based off of the court transcript, and it dramatizes the inconsistencies in Blondie's testimony. So from my understanding, it plays upon the doubt for the sake of drama. But it's just so bizarre to me, because the Spanish play, divorced from an Australian context, exists. If anyone in the audience speaks Spanish, I will give you $50 to watch it and tell me if it's any good or not. I can't speak Spanish, no clue, should have watched more Dora the Explorer, and the only person I do know who speaks Spanish said no. He was like, I don't want to spend 3.5 hours of my life watching the Spanish play, and I only speak Spanish at home, and I don't think I understand it well enough to watch it for 3 hours. Shout out to Eli in New South Wales. This is not the first time that the Port Arthur Massacre has been the subject of theatre. There was a critically acclaimed theatre production around 2007. There'll probably be like a correction here. Some of them also won awards. They focus generally on the grief of survivors. But the Spanish play! This is where I have to, unfortunately, bring up the topic of Port Arthur's song. Now, to my knowledge, I don't know any songs that were written about the victims or the event itself. Like in the same way country singers wrote about 9/11, for example.
9/11. I said 9/11, 9/11.
But there are a small contingent of Port Arthur Truther songs, which are frequently shared in these Port Arthur groups. This song was written by Sherry Bonnie, a person I have never heard of before. Let's take a quick look at her Twitter account before we get into the song.
COVID denial? TERF? Anti-vaxxer? Oh, hi Dr. Carrie Maget. Look at her website. Look at these classy lads. I would love to hear their songs. I'm afraid I can't play it for copyright reasons, and I don't particularly want to hear them again, because it has lyrics like this.
Looks like I'm trapped in time. I'm told I can't be freed. What's Riston doing to me? You know I spoke the truth way back then. Again and again, again and again. Why am I in prison? What's my crime? I know I'm trapped, say they, that I am to blame. Hey, what can I do? Government took me, locked me away. Hey, what can I do?
Hey, what did I do? What indeed? It really makes you think, huh? Why'd y'all do this? It turns out that she's a children's entertainer as well. Now, I'm sure she's lovely with the kids. This is not an attack on her as a person. Kids love music and nursery rhymes. I just hope that she leaves the Port Arthur and vaccine songs at home. So interestingly, Google says that she lives in Risdon Prison. Which I'm sure is just a mistake, but I think it's a funny mistake. It's like, imagine you're a person and your kid's having a birthday party and they're like, oh man, this person, Sherry Bonnie, showed up to my school. And I just want this Sherry Bonnie to be at my birthday party. So your parents are like, oh, okay, we'll look her up. Oh, okay, what's her number? Risdon! I can't imagine it's going to be swell for business. I think you should probably check that out, Sherry. Rage. Next up, we have a hip-hop beat to sweep you off your feet, and lyrics to rot your brain like dementia.
In 1996, on April 28th, in Tasmania, Port Arthur was a fatal day.
Really? It's a Tasmanian rapper who's had some success. According to this old Triple J article, he toured with Exhibit, Hobson, oh no, and the brain behind the Wu-Tang Clan, the Jizza, the genius himself. So before I go further, I don't want to hate on this guy. I'm genuinely happy to see a successful Tasmanian rapper getting good gigs and putting himself out there. Also, he has the courage to perform a diss rap in Glenorchy bus mold. I grew up around Glenorchy, that shit's tough.
Further, I watched some videos with Greeley in them, and he seems like a really nice guy. The way he describes Risdon Prison reminds me of some people that I went to high school with. He seems like the cheeky kid who got in a lot of trouble, but everyone referred to as a legend.
This man is significantly better at speaking than me. I can barely go a sentence without stuttering. I just think this song is funny. Also, Greeley, mate, please make a diss track about me. There is so much to make fun of, dude.
Question of Guilt is a song that came out in 2014, and it's not very good. I'm not here to critique the beat, which is generic and uninspired even by 2014 standards, but I'm here to talk about why he thinks Blondie is innocent. This video has 100,000 views after all. It is the most viewed piece of Port Arthur truth propaganda out there. And the comment section is full of hundreds of truthers praising him for telling the truth. Question of Guilt... Cog rattles off several talking points, Blondie's IQ being too low and the government being corrupt. The most unique attribute about this song is the delivery of its subject matter. Now, what I think is interesting about this song is that it is using Blondie as a tool to argue that the Tassie judicial system is systemically broken. Now sure, he never mentions it directly in the lyrics, but what is interesting to me is everything that is left unsaid.
So, I think that there are plenty of problems with Risdon Prison. We have this systemic critique, right? That we are treating prisoners as repeat customers. We don't have a focus on rehabilitation of the prisoner to bring them back into society as functional members, but instead, Risdon is unnecessarily cruel to its prisoners, only assuring that they don't re-assimilate back into the public. Its facilities are woefully understaffed, overcrowded, and the living conditions are not up to the standards that we should expect for our tax dollars. The prison conditions in Tasmania are atrocious, and they need to be improved, and prisoners still deserve basic human rights. And of course, in case you think I'm going to gloss over it, I'm logically committed to saying that in regards to Blondie as well. He's a piece of shit, he should never get out of prison, he deserves basic human rights.
Now, it's tricky to convey a systemic critique into a song. It would just be a bunch of statistics after all. And it can be done. Yasinbe, known as Most Deaf, always blows my mind. So, using this idea of conspiracy is a provocative way to get that point across. There is a real critique that you can make about Tasmania's prison system, but Blondie's supposed innocence is not one of them. You're using this conspiracy as a symbol of being against the law. There are some other songs, but none of them are anywhere near as interesting or entertaining as these first two, so I'll leave it at that for now.
If music's not your cup of tea, then might I suggest some fine Australian cinema perchance.
When he was a little boy, we used to play a game at the fabric shop in town.
This has been a developing story throughout my research, and it's been really crazy to see how successful this movie has been.
Nitram is a movie that came out in 2021, and it is about Blondie's life leading up to the Port Arthur Massacre. This is an independent Australian crime drama produced by Good Things Studios. It is directed by Justin Kurzel, who did the Assassin's Creed movie and the true history of the Kelly Gang on Stan. Oh, and he also did Snowtown, which is a movie that I really like. Caleb Laundrie Jones plays Blondie. He won Best Actor at Cannes Film Festival for his portrayal, which is crazy.
You might know Caleb from Get Out as the creepy brother. I know him primarily from Twin Peaks: The Return, and a movie called Antiviral, which I hate.
It's gross and it's yucky, and it makes me feel the exact same way I feel when I see Blondie's face. So, extreme points for casting. This movie caused a lot of controversy down here in Tasmania.
People were like, oh, no one should be profiting off of the Port Arthur Massacre in Tasmania, which I think is very fair. But there are going to be select viewings at the State Cinema for people who want to go in, and they're not going to advertise it at all, no posters, nothing like that. So I think they're genuinely being very sensitive. The argument is that sort of younger people deserve to know about this, and I believe in that thoroughly as well. It's part of the motivation of why I want to do this. In fact, we're going to go see it tonight at the State Cinema.
Right, so you just watched through Nitram.
I find it really difficult to talk about Nitram now that I've properly seen it. I sort of have a line that I use to sort of express my feelings because...
How would you feel as a piece of media it portrayed the incident and it portrayed Blondie?
I don't know what to say. It's been a long time since a movie left me that speechless. Justin Kurzel, you're a piece of shit.
I basically say, you know, so far I've written over 60,000 words about the Port Arthur Massacre, but Nitram left me absolutely speechless. Or the correspondent for the review referred to it as the silence to end all silences in the theatre, and I've never had a theatre experience quite like it. I only found more respect for Kurzel after the movie, and I already really liked him due to Snowtown. When it comes to Stan, I really recommend whoever is watching this to give it a watch. Kurzel, who lives in Tasmania, seems to be obsessed with stories about Australian folklore, stories of Australian outlaws and criminals becoming legends, stories about abuse, masculinity, and the way that is propelled by self-delusion. Oh, and Assassin's Creed. Choosing the Port Arthur shooter's life fits well within that sequence.
I do not particularly want a movie to be made about Blondie, but it is an interesting story. The Alana and Madeline Foundation has supported the movie publicly, and the director has genuinely come across as sensitive to public issues.
Going back and forth to Tasmania now for 25 years, and now live there, so I'm deeply aware of how difficult this is, and so it's been a process, and it still is, and each day we kind of moved forward with the film. I think we just have kept on questioning, where are we with it? What are we trying to tell with the film? How are we trying to tell it?
But then you start to realise that there's a generation, 2 generations, my kids now who are 15, who really don't know much about it, And down in Tasmania, when you speak to young people, because it's not spoken about very much, because it's almost taboo to talk about it. The conversation, the dialogue about it is very thin.
We never wanted to impose ourselves on the community that suffered this horrific tragedy. At the same time, we've wanted to be available and transparent.
We felt the power of gun reform because we felt on that day we were shocked as September 11th.
Bon and I deliberately didn't watch any films. We deliberately didn't read any articles about other shootings. We were very focused and forensic about this particular event, and that's how the film's made, and I guess it's how we watch it. Yeah.
But now, it's 25 years. Generations haven't really had an opportunity, I think, to sort of understand it, talk about it, discuss it, and I find that really curious that now those gun reforms, are being softened. We have more guns in Australia now than we did in 1996.
I mean, they also did make Wolf Creek and Wolf Creek 2. If we're going to talk about tasteless adaptations of something, a tragedy that happened in Australian history, we should probably start there because they're very questionable. I like the first Wolf Creek. It's very fun, nice little thriller. Pretty grisly. The second one's fucking
Take me to a while back, Jack. Take me to a while back.
Bonkers.
Wasp, on the other hand, is tasteless garbage, and I hate it. This movie is still in production, but it is 2 different projects headed by indie Melbourne filmmaker Paul Motor.
Wasp is the movie Australia doesn't want made, and it will be the most dangerous film to come out of this country in years. Since my decision to make this film in 2016, I have personally received multiple death threats and been unofficially warned off by ex-police, government and military personnel.
One being a film in which the trailer depicts some scenes of the shooting, and the other being a Port Arthur Truth documentary that claims to contain deep research. It also seems to romanticize Blondie. Look, in my opinion, this is tasteless garbage, and Paul wanted $3 million for it. I wish that was a joke. On Indiegogo, you can see the remnants of an abandoned campaign. He managed to get $3,000 off of these people. Paul continues his grift in the comment sections of Facebook posts. He positions himself as a free speech warrior and says that the movie will show the truth behind the massacre. And don't get me wrong, I love exploitation movies and pushing social taboos. I love the Gaspar Noés and the John Waters of the world. And I have a wonderful time indulging in some, trash movies that are complete disasters. But there is a matter of taste and intent. Gaspar Noé, John Waters, and Lars von Trier can get away with being provocative, the former two more so, because they are talented. Paul cannot even light a scene correctly. To commodify the shooting like this is an extraordinarily bad taste. John Waters' first movie was about the Kennedy assassination, shortly after it happened. Why am I criticizing Paul for doing the same? Well, Kennedy was a powerful man with a large government behind him. He was the only victim. Not sure that was his driver, I guess. Whereas the Port Arthur Massacre has incalculable damage and trauma associated with it.
Now, Mr. Moto will claim that his movie is objective. However, its base and the people he advertises the movie to are overwhelmingly conspiracy theorists who want to feel validated. And validating people's opinions is not objective. Let's remember, the halfway point between truth and a lie is still a lie, Paul.
Making a movie at their expense is not just in bad taste, it is very morally questionable, especially when it comes from a truther angle.
I was editing this part, and I suddenly came across Paul Motor's acting reel.
Who you talk to? Nobody. That's who. Nobody's gonna talk to me. You want a fucking invitation?
It's quite something else. Cards on the table, I actually think he plays a pretty good hitman.
The boss wants to see you.
What boss?
Ring any bells?
The peanut guy.
No, not the peanut guy, above that.
It actually kind of slaps. And I'm not one to sit on top of my high horse, I'm a shit actor. But oh my god.
Are you crazy? If they are crooked and I fuck with them, they're gonna come after me.
You'll do as I tell you, or I'll fuck with you right now.
I saw the scorn.
Happy cock.
In her eyes. And the disgust in her eyes. And I reached out for my beloved in her eyes to draw her to me.
Brothers and sisters, my church is the whorehouse. Claws. None of those tiny little wiggly hands that fucking T-Rex had. This monster had fucking claws on it. And a fucking beak. Suddenly this fucking giant bird monster comes out of left nowhere. Fucking pick! Fucking pick! What are you doing now? Don't you people got jobs tomorrow morning? Oh yeah, I know what it's like. Oh, hey, what night is it? It's Sunday night. It's party night. Let's go out. Let's get fucked up. Come on, let's go there. Wow. You know what it's like though. You know what it's like Monday morning. Peel yourself away from the pillar. Fucking pick!
We've discussed Port Arthur Truth in the context of what they believe and how they express themselves, but one interesting aspect that has only been mentioned in passing is the politics of this conspiracy theory. So obviously, wanting your guns back from John Howard is one aspect of this belief, especially to the older members of Cluster A and the really radical members of Cluster B. So to understand this better, the notion of positive and negative freedoms is a classical libertarian notion. Classical libertarianism is about emphasizing the individual in the face of a communitarian whole. So positive freedoms serve as an entitlement to something. We ought to have entitlements to free water and food, a right to be sheltered or to be taken care of when we are sick. Negative freedoms, however, are entitlements in a different way. It is protection from something, our entitlement to not be stabbed when walking down the street, for example.
Now, libertarianism has its origins in the liberalism of John Locke. Thinkers such as Robert Nozick and Milton Friedman recontextualized libertarianism into what is now known as American libertarianism. I know it's cliche to quote Orwell, But to borrow a quote from Animal Farm, American libertarianism runs on a certain all animals are equal but some are more equal than others kind of logic. It is all about expanding certain individuals' rights and allowing those people to infringe on the rights of others. Having rights is valuable, but not necessarily universal. They allow market logic to cloud their value judgments. Honestly, I could write an entire chapter talking about why I think American libertarianism is utter garbage! We don't have time for that, even though I think it's a fascinating topic. But philosopher Dr. Adrian Bardon sums up my thoughts exactly, and he articulates my thoughts far better than I ever could. He uses the term property rights libertarianism as analogous to libertarian conservatism.
The property rights libertarian often also coincidentally agrees with the economic conservative that a free market capitalist economy is the most efficient at providing individuals with the best opportunity to achieve their goals. But this is not what makes such a system most just. The fundamental problem with taxes, regulation and social spending is not that it is inefficient as a way of promoting collective and individual goals, but rather that all state interventions involve morally illegitimate violations of individual rights to life, liberty and property, unless themselves directed at protections of life, liberty and property. Property rights libertarianism is fundamentally a vehicle for the rationalisation of self-interest, racism and status quo classism. The property rights libertarians' argument in support of an economic order in which property rights are natural and absolute. First, in a world of limited resources, the notion of natural and absolute property rights is fundamentally and inescapably incompatible with the libertarians' acknowledged duty to respect others' equal right to liberty. The institution of unrestricted private property would allow, in principle, for the privatisation of all natural resources, leaving the propertyless, many just having had the bad fortune to not being the first of the scene, utterly at the mercy of their landlords. You must further deny the implications of any system if natural property rights on the liberty of future generations, the unlucky, the disabled, and the victims of discrimination. If you are committed to prioritising freedom of action, your only choices are to deny any rightful claims to property whatsoever, or to allow a system that any system of property rights must be accompanied by a system therein taxation on income from property is used to compensate the less fortunate for the impoverishment of their opportunities actuated by society's recognition of private property claims.
What a legend. I highly recommend his book, The Truth About Denial. It's an absolute slapper. Comment below if you'd be interested in seeing my top 5 favourite books I've read for research. That's certainly up there. Anyways, this has not just been a passionate tangent. It is fundamental to understand the blatant hypocrisy of libertarian desire. Bardon criticizes the conservative libertarian at an academic level, the logic of late-stage capitalism and neoliberalism. However, when it comes to Port Arthur truth, they are literally capital C and capital L conservative libertarians, but they do not identify themselves with these labels. The negative right to not be shot with a military rifle do not matter because they infringe upon positive freedom to own said rifles.
Yeah, I'm coming in before everyone starts screaming, "Wag! Strawman! Strawman!" Yes, I know I could have worded that a little bit more delicately. It would be more accurate to state that a conservative libertarian would encourage the victim to purchase their own weapon for their own protection. Their assault does not outweigh the strawman's right to own a firearm. This argument only enriches gun companies, but go off. Now, often these arguments come from a bad faith position. If I may take an example from Peter Charlie's How to Sell a Massacre, the NRA team offered a suggestion to the One Nation representatives on what their party might say to Australian critics in the middle of another Port Arthur type mass shooting. How dare you stand on the graves of those children to put forth your political agenda? Daleside said. Like, if your policy isn't good enough to stand on its own, how dare you use their deaths to push that forward? There was a brief silence in the room as the Australian visitors took in the power of Daleside's strategy. Ashby said. That's really good. It's very strong.
Port Arthur truth is extremely partisan. I have mentioned that I have encountered an individual left-leaning person in this space, but they were an outlier. This overwhelming majority are conservative libertarian types. In an early draft of this piece, I said that they were comparable to the American Patriot movement. Nyworch describes this ideology as alt-America, a group of conservative libertarians loving oppression. They are extremely xenophobic and everything phobic. I still believe this point, but there isn't as much research on this topic, so I don't feel entirely comfortable making a one-to-one comparison. In my research, I did find this one fascinating clip from the '96 gun debate.
Good evening. Extreme elements in the gun lobby have been widely condemned tonight for threatening a bloody revolt in response to John Howard's firearms reforms.
Gympie overnight, the right-wing fringe of the gun lobby turned very ugly.
You can send a message all the way down to Canberra to that sawn-off little dickhead Jackboot Johnny.
In a night of extraordinary claims, the shooters said blood would have to be spilt to buy back their freedom.
The only currency that you can purchase freedom back with is blood. And I know you're a bit angry about this shit. You're a bit pissed off. Well, I can assure you I haven't calmed down yet. I'm still wild.
John Howard's firearm crackdown was also blamed on homosexuals, with claims they've taken over governments and that shooters need
to get rid of the homosexual Gestapo.
The views being expressed publicly are very disappointing.
Well, I simply don't support it.
And gun control groups have warned it was similar sentiments which led to the Waco massacre and the Oklahoma City bombing in America.
It's extraordinary to me that just 2 weeks after that horrible massacre in Port Arthur, these type of people can be roaming around the country calling for the spilling of more blood.
The Queensland...
if they can't abide by a cabinet decision, they resign.
Now some people who own the sort of guns that slaughtered 35 people at Port Arthur are making chilling threats. Threats to the Prime Minister and threats of blood in the street.
Part of their plan involves taking over Australia, and they believe they are the only people who can save Australia.
Would point out to Mr. Howard and his Liberal ministers that we also know where they live.
It's illegal in any state of Australia to have a gun for the
Rebecca Peters from the Coalition for Gun Control took McNiven on in a Today Tonight debate, but was not prepared for this off-air aside.
To Rebecca Peters and Ian McNiven, thank you.
My pleasure. If I was married to Rebecca, I'd probably commit domestic. Well,
perhaps you could finish that. What did he say?
He said, if I was married to Rebecca, I'd probably commit domestic violence too. On the one hand, I think he's obviously an utter crackpot who shouldn't be taken seriously. On the other hand, it's shocking to hear someone talking about committing violence against me personally. He's clearly a person who fantasises about committing violence, and I would say that makes him a person who should not be owning a gun.
Many of them repeat myths of some of the extreme pseudo-religious groups in America, where they talk about having a God-given right to defend yourself from the evil government. And so they find that they have a responsibility, as they see it, to the future of Australia, to totally disregard any normal understanding of democratic rights.
Something that I think is interesting by itself is that Port Arthur Truth is actually secular. While websites like The Dark Truth are unambiguously far-right Christian, Pats tend to leave the biblical talk at the door. Now, based on my own observations, I haven't even perceived a small Christian minority in this movement. I don't particularly have a point to make here, I just think it's really interesting. You normally find some weird Christian subset in other conspiracy theories like this.
Conspiracists seem to be living in an alternate version of reality, where the establishment is out to get them specifically, and the only way they can be stopped is to crack down on political correctness. It's nonsensical. They see themselves as patriotic citizens, but they don't realise that they hate the infrastructure that upholds their country.
In fact, according to university lecturer Natalie Zaik, patriot is such an overused word that is difficult to define. While it can stand for anyone who shows affection for their country, it is often used in a mythical context. To be a patriot is to fight for your ideals against oppression. You love the idea of your country and the values you believe it represents, so you fight for those perceived ideals.
They are not patriots, they are nationalists, and I have absolutely no time for nationalists. But what happens when you are no longer fighting a more powerful force? Well, you must create a new enemy to fight against, a powerful enemy that is vaguely defined. This strategy is often referred to as populism. Now, populism is an often vaguely defined and overused word. Populism is not an ideology, but rather a strategy for organising political approach.
Populism posits that the party of the many is going to rise up against the powerful, the population versus the establishment. The strategy is neither inherently left or right-wing. Jacinta Ardern and Donald Trump have both been called populists. The difference between the binary is who the supposed powerful are. Those on the left wing argue that rich capitalists are destroying the world, which they are, and right-wing people are more likely to argue that greedy governments and brown people are destroying the world.
Right-wing populists are far more likely to blame cultural Marxism for the ills of society. According to journalist Mike Wendling, cultural Marxism can be defined in the modern political context as
pretty much anything from the left of the political spectrum is at risk of being tarred by this particular brush. Feminism, gay rights, birth control, socialism, atheism, relativism, environmentalism, immigration, multiculturalism. It's an all-encompassing conspiracy being driven by an uncertain cabal. The plot is a subversive one, pushed by bankers, Jews, leftist intellectuals, the establishment, the deep state, or any number or combination of groups.
This unfortunately ties back into the anti-Semitism of the Port Arthur Truth movement. Cultural Marxism is a useful tool to understand what Port Arthur Truth and other right-wing populists as a whole do not like. It is a term that can be used as a dog whistle for any kind of progress. So, we know what kind of politics they believe, but what are the politics that they follow? They're different, I swear. To understand Port Arthur Truth, we must understand the contemporary political context. High-profile criminal barrister and political commentator Greg Barnes. Have you seen a photo of this guy's face? Fucking huge. He has a jawline that out here. Roided out ScoMo.
I'm gonna out-roid ScoMo any day.
According to Barnes, it was Howard's attempt to emphasise with One Nation voters, instead of directly denouncing them, that led to this new type of white resentment politics festering and becoming more mainstream.
I and most Australians want our immigration policy radically reviewed and that of multiculturalism abolished. I believe we are in danger of being swamped by Asians. A truly multicultural country can never be strong or united. Do we want or need any of these people here? I am one red-blooded Australian who says no, and who speaks for 90% of Australians.
She's got a problem, right? She's simplistic.
Yes, well that's dead right.
And we can understand her.
Speak for yourself. Silent Johnny Howard's approach, ridiculed by Alan Ramsey, was to congratulate himself that
the pall of censorship on certain issues had been lifted since his government's election.
Mr Howard's strategy hasn't worked. Despite his reticence, Ms Hanson has received a mountain of publicity.
He eventually thrashed the Queensland Independent MP with a feather, in a manner which simply suggested he was not about to alienate what seemed to be quite a large number of sympathetic voters.
a certain amount of unanimity as to the remedy.
There is a heavy responsibility on Mr Howard to condemn Ms Hanson.
Mr Howard must now take a stand against the divisive and extremist view of Ms Hanson.
But Michelle Grattan saw a certain hypocrisy in the media's demands.
They can't walk away from responsibility and demand that Howard do something when the inflated publicity then boosts her in the polls.
The previous weekend, her visit to Perth had been accorded all the seriousness of the Michael Jackson tour by Channel 7, which I allow has never really grasped the concept of journalism.
Pauline Hanson flew into Perth this afternoon and into the eye of a storm.
This is my first visit to WA, so it's exciting.
Taken 14 months, but finally the Prime Minister has taken Pauline Hanson head-on. In a verbal assault on the leader of the One Nation Party, Mr Howard was careful not to offend the people who support her. And in fact, far from being wounded by the attack, Pauline Hanson says John Howard has just proved he's a closet supporter.
John Howard was opening the Australasia Centre, addressing the first meeting of the Asia Society. And he told the audience Australia's engagement with Asia was a key government strategy. But he used the occasion to step up his attack on Pauline Hanson.
She is wrong when she says that Australia is in danger of being swamped by Asians.
But he continues to defend most of her supporters.
It would, however, be a serious mistake to attack those who are apparently attracted to her as bigoted, narrow-minded and racist. A few, no doubt, are. Most, however, are not.
By the end of April, the polls couldn't be denied. The Herald's graphic for its own poll had one nation at 25% and more, but an embarrassed editorialist wanted to disown that.
It would be easy, but wrong, to superficially interpret the results.
A Morgan poll in the Bulletin shows it with 10% of the national vote.
Most of their supporters come from disillusioned Liberal National Party voters.
Absolute nonsense, of course, but even the Bulletin's result, 10%, and most of them coalition voters, was enough to force the Prime Minister's hand. Not so much a gun held to his head as a pole pointed at his heart. Thoughtless media and an irresolute leader make for the prolongation of the disease.
But for many Asian leaders, the Prime Minister's attack has come too late. The Indonesian Foreign Minister Ali Alatas is reported as saying the One Nation Party is damaging Australian-Asian relations, with our role in regional initiatives being undermined by the perception of rising racism.
The second event that Bond cites is the Tampa incident. Now, people my age might have very vague memories of the news and the word Tampa, but they don't really know what it was all about.
When the Tampa first sailed into Australian waters after rescuing more than 400 Muslim asylum seekers, no one could have predicted the dramatic sea change ahead.
I can't remember one single issue which has more transformed politics than the decision taken by the Howard government late August this year to repel by military means all future boat asylum seekers and boat refugees.
It was no coincidence that Howard was facing an election in 2001 and had lost a previously safe Liberal seat in Brisbane earlier that year. The hostile response by the Howard government to the Tampa's plea for humanity on the part of the Australian government was immensely popular.
It's also about having an uncompromising view about the fundamental right of this country to protect its borders. It's about this nation saying to the world, we are a generous, open-hearted people, taking more refugees on a per capita basis than any nation except Canada. We have a proud record of welcoming people from 140 different nations. But we will decide who comes to this country and the circumstances in which they come.
In Afghanistan or Iraq, there was no Australian embassy. The idea of a queue was a fantasy. And the people on the boats were not illegals. Australia's laws gave them the right to seek asylum here.
The thrashing of Liberal values was deeply disturbing. There was no traditional oversight and there were no consequences for wrongdoing. The blatant disregard for Australia's obligations under international and domestic migration laws, the Border Protection Bill 2001, stated that no person would be assessed to see if they fitted the criteria for refugee status.
Jenny McHenry was the head of public affairs for the Department of Defence.
We were told quite clearly that all information was to come out of the Minister's office, that there were to be no comments issued through public relations or through the Defence Department.
I gather our people saw that as...
Peter Reith's office set specific requirements for the information that would be released.
We were told that there was to be nothing in the public forum which would humanise these people. We were quite stunned. We, I think, had perceived that the line was going to be hard, but we didn't realise it was going to be that hard.
What John Howard has been able to do with the Tampa issue is to finally take the oxygen out of the One Nation movement by running a tough, isolationist approach.
A dozen people threw themselves overboard. Fearing that the whole lot would jump, Banks sent a boarding party to bring the situation under control. The ship's camera caught a rough image of the exchange.
When the boarding party came back on board, they were talking about how some people had jumped into the water and that another guy had, held up his child and saying, look, we've got our family on board, we've got children on board.
We didn't know the language and this was the only way to communicate to these people. So he was holding his child to tell them, like, look, we have children, like, if you don't care about me, care about my child.
In the middle of these events, Captain Banks received a phone call from his commander in Darwin. Wires got crossed. Later, Banks insisted he said adults were throwing themselves overboard. His commander was just as certain he'd been told they were throwing their children into the water.
On no occasion did the Defence Organisation produce any evidence to the Prime Minister's Department and Office, in which corroborated the original report that no children had been thrown overboard. And despite Defence Minister Peter Reith's office learning within hours of his statement that this was untrue, Reith did not correct the record at the time, and did not admit he had been told this statement was false.
In the lead up to election, they were speaking about a lot. And, a lot of them were saying this, I think, could be very helpful to us.
Yeah, I think it has to be described as a moral panic. There was a lot of discussion and disquiet within the Labor Party, but the view of those who were inclined, I suppose, to think the worst of the Australian community and that it wasn't capable of persuading them held sway.
The BPB did not pass the Senate, but a certain taboo had been crossed in the media. Now, you could have people come on television being openly hostile to asylum seekers, and it could be immensely popular. The embrace of fake news in Australian politics helped Howard get re-elected in the 2001 election. The dehumanisation of refugees is still a significant problem and a national point of shame in Australia.
The third event that Bond cites is the beginning of the War on Terror. This is significant because it accelerated the rate of so-called anti-terror laws.
Australia's response to September 11 was like that of many other countries. We passed extraordinary laws that challenged long-held assumptions about how the criminal law should operate.
An enemy that operates in the shadows and views the entire world as a battlefield is not one that can be contained or deterred.
All up, we've passed 61 new anti-terror statutes since September 11. 13 of those were passed during the life of the Rudd and Gillard governments, but in fact most of those, 48 in fact, were passed during the life of the Howard government. That meant from 2001 to 2007, Australia enacted 48 anti-terror statutes, or an average of one new anti-terror law every 6.7 weeks.
The recent releases of American military information from WikiLeaks show evidence of tens of thousands of civilian casualties as a result of our invasion of Iraq, as well as widespread abuse and torture of prisoners. There were no weapons of mass destruction found.
It obviously covers such things as hijacking planes or bombing people, but it goes further than that in also dealing with acts of liberation that, even though they involve violence and political motives, are the sorts of things that we wouldn't necessarily regard as terrorism.
How should you be held accountable for Australian participation in the war of Iraq? War on Iraq. You just said a moment ago that you defend our participation and you leading our country into a war that most Australians oppose. How do you defend it?
I will continue to defend, as I extensively do in my book, the original decision on the basis on which it was taken.
Okay, no, we're not going to do that. Please.
And this is for the Iraqi
someone please remove.
Barnes argues these three events in our history are not merely of historical interest, but they are critical signifiers to the rise of right-wing populism.
All of the people involved in this event are considered to be huge lefties by Port Arthur Truth. I must emphasize here that they really hate John Howard. It's impossible for me to describe how much they hate John Howard here. You'd think that Howard killed their dog or something. They see Howard as authoritarian, not because of his attempts to pass the BPB, but because he sensibly reformed our gun control laws. They believe that he was part of an NWO plot that orchestrated Port Arthur, but not at fault for Australian war crimes during the War on Terror. They don't hate Howard because they have specific disagreements with him. They hate a character who is completely unlike the man who held office. It is important to remember, like from Chapter 4, they do not literally hate Howard as some kind of authoritarian communist. They want him as a scapegoat for their problems. There are many in these spaces who call for his head to be on a spike. A great day of retribution for the powerless.
This is also American to me, and it is impossible here to ignore the role of American propaganda in Australian politics. Early on in my research, I came across this video in the Port Arthur groups.
Carrying signs and chanting, "We want justice," more than 2,000 angry Australians delivered a personal message to Parliament's doorstep.
The bottom line is people want to know that they have a right to defend themselves.
I was just instantly perplexed by the American woman's voiceover and the overt focus on Americans. It didn't seem right to me. The narrator, Ginny Simone, is a longtime NRA advocate, and the video was made in support of the 2000 election of George W. Bush. Are you surprised at all?
Gun owners in Australia told me back in 1998 when I was there that the unforgettable images of their guns confiscated by the government should be a wake-up call to all of us.
A gun buyback that forced law-abiding citizens to surrender their firearms. 640,000 ordinary conventional firearms confiscated and destroyed.
It was an absolute joke and a tragedy. I actually turned in 3 firearms and it broke my heart.
I mean, it was 40 years of collecting and I can't say it any other way than that. I felt sick. I had to hand them in because if I didn't, I was going to jail.
There's no ifs or buts about that. By taking that gun away from me, they've stolen something from me.
The NRA was highly critical of the agreement and expressed great sympathy for Australian firearm owners, who it believed that suffered a great injustice at the hands of a tyrannous government. The NRA was unrelenting in its hostility. Ahead of the United States election in 2000, the NRA posted a 30-minute infomercial video featuring the destruction of thousands of Australian firearms relinquished during the buyback. An unnamed narrator claimed that firearm crime had increased in Australia since 1996, with armed robbery increasing by 69%, assaults involving firearms by 28%, murders by gunshot by 28%, and home invasions by 21%. No source for the statistics was mentioned. The NRA's statistics were misleading and inaccurate, despite its fear that Australian experience might increase the likelihood of more restrictive laws being passed in the United States. The NFA has not prompted any changes to America's laws. And when you look in the comment section for this video, it is full of conservative libertarian types lamenting the loss of their guns, the tyranny of the Australian government. They're oblivious to the obvious propaganda in front of them.
Their warning to Americans? Don't think it can't happen to you. It can, and it already is.
Unless you, as a firearms owner, get off your butt now and start to oppose those that want to take them off of you right here and now, I would say that within 5 to 10 years, the restrictions on gun owners in America will be similar to what happens in Australia.
Since the 1970s, there have been growing fears that American gun culture was making its way to Australia alongside every other import from the United States. There was an irony here. For much of his prime ministership, John Howard was accused of being too close to the Bush administration. The political space in which Pats exist is one of stark contrast. They live in a fantasy land. It's not just the media that has been Americanized.
The politics of the 2000s does not stop there, because perhaps unwillingly, Port Arthur truth is heavily influenced by internet culture wars. I was just scrolling my phone in between takes, and I just came across this meme in, Port Arthur, Tasmania Exposed. This is a watermelon. If you see an apple, you're a conspiracy theorist. Thank you, the soy boy. I'm just going to start reading out the comments. Conspiracy theorist, not. I ain't. Truth is it is an apple. Prove me wrong. I see a lone wolf gunman. Oh, no, that's an apple, you fucking moron.
It's an apple.
Oh, great. We're getting into the attack helicopter jokes.
Oh, god damn.
It identifies as a wombat. I love being right some of the time because all I see is an apple. I don't post in these Port Arthur groups.
It's entirely lurking, yeah.
I'm lurking, I'm learning, gathering evidence.
Yeah.
You know, and I will get kicked out if I make up too much of a fuss, but God, they're funny. Sometimes they're just very funny.
I'm waiting for the day that they find this docker.
Me too. I can't wait to we'll probably cut this out, but I cannot wait. I can't wait to be like,
hello there. Jackboot Johnny.
And as with most things on the internet, it all began on 4chan. I'm a little racial slur. 4chan has always been at the front of meme culture and online radicalization. There is little to no moderation on the site, and the algorithm rewards the controversial. Speech on platforms like this quickly becomes nihilistic and toxic. This has two effects. The irreverence attracts actual bigots who are tolerated in these spaces, and the extreme toxicity pushes anyone away who can't stomach it. A feedback loop is established, and 4chan becomes a site of extremes. Attributes such as radical anonymity and radical freedom of speech leads to toxicity, and this manifests itself in events that we remember, such as Gamergate. To massively oversimplify, gamers, online atheists, and self-described men's rights activists brigaded and harassed female journalists and video game developers in the guise of ethics in video games.
Ethics in journalism.
It was about ethics in video games.
I thought it was video games journalism.
We were both wrong, and it doesn't matter. They just wanted an excuse to harass women online.
According to cultural critic Angela Nagel, these communities were ripe for radicalization.
Without getting too far into the minutiae, and at this point it would be impossible to reach the end of all the various accusations of lies and contestations of how the mass event unfolded. The important feature of the Furor here is the role it played in uniting different online groups and in spreading the tactics of Chan culture to the online right. Gamergate brought gamers, rightists, Chan culture, anti-feminism, and the online far right closer to the mainstream discussion, and it also politicized a broad group of young people, mostly boys, who organized tactics around the idea of fighting back against the culture war being waged by the cultural left.
The alt-right was forged from the ashes of Gamergate. YouTube channels and blogs, once established as platforms for raging about lesbians in video games, oh my.
Oh no, the lesbians.
The lesbians! Get out of my chambers, lesbian! Raging about lesbians in video games became radicalizing platforms for pseudo-intellectuals. The ranks of radicalized young emasculated men were bolstered, and strategies developed to harass video game journalists and developers were practiced and improved upon to harass activists and commit online hate crimes.
The poisonous side of Gamergate became seen by activists not as a bug, but as a positive feature. Those involved in the campaign saw how effective trolling was in generating attention and silencing enemies, and it was soon adopted and celebrated as a tactic.
4chan was also instrumental in the election of Donald Trump. Anyone online in 2016 remembers the hellscape that was the Pepe culture wars. What is most relevant for our purposes is #Pizzagate. You might remember this from the news. A man went into an American pizza parlor with a gun because he heard a conspiracy theory online about the Clintons running a sex trafficking ring inside the building's basement. You'll be surprised to hear that the building didn't have a basement. And the whole thing was a ridiculous fake news stunt meant to slander the Clinton name further. And in such a hellscape, it was only a matter of time before these conspiracy theorists became violent. Now, what is so significant about Pizzagate is that the conspiracy theory was adopted by many of the establishment conservatives under the president-elect Trump, to quote Wendling.
Pizzagate showed how an outlandish web of speculation and innuendo could rally thousands online and draw in people who would appear to have little common cause with the alt-right.
Another journalist named Mike Rothschild argues that Pizzagate was an essential conspiracy theory that primed the internet for QAnon.
Q never uses the term Pizzagate, but one easily follows from the other. And it should be no surprise that the right-wing media figures who pumped out videos and memes about Pizzagate would shift to Q less than a year later. Anti-Clinton media figures and foreign troll farms relentlessly pushed Pizzagate in the days before and after the election, leading to a torrent of threats against the Ping Pong Pizza restaurant.
Before we can go forward, I have to explain a new way of looking at conspiracy theory. We have come across a lot of history and theory which assumes that the theorist literally believes everything that they say. But I would like you to consider that the words that people say are not always emblematic of what they believe. When we were talking about Judaism in chapter 4, we talked about how anti-Semites believed in this nebulous worldwide Jewish conspiracy, even though many of their claims were dead wrong. This is because sometimes the act of saying something is more important than the actual words we say. Suppose a couple are getting married. When each person says, "I do," they are proclaiming a promise. The act is more important than the words they say. Similarly, with anti-Semitism, the act of saying Jews control the world is not meant to be taken literally.
Did you fix this then, baby?
Yes, I fixed it!
Did you?
The parts are Jewish.
What parts in a car are Jewish? Spark plugs?
Spark plugs. The Jews invented spark plugs to control global traffic.
What they mean is, we want to persecute Jewish people. Hate speech is not literal, it is symbolic. It is what they want it to be. This is where we come across what Professors Russell Muirhead and Nancy Rosenblum call the new conspiracism. In their book, a lot of people are saying, they observe that conspiracy theories have changed in the past 15 years. What they refer to as classic conspiracism was sometimes far-fetched, sometimes accurate, and sometimes a vexing mix of the two. Classic conspiracism tries to make sense of a disorderly and complicated world by insisting that powerful people control the course of events. The logic of classic conspiracism makes sense of things by imposing a version of proportionality. Muirhead and Rosenblum describe this type of conspiracism as a kind of clumsy detective work.
The dots are woven into a comprehensible narrative of events. Warranted or not, classic conspiracism is conspiracy with a theory.
But they argue that something went very wrong. They cannot definitively say. Classic conspiracism was thrown by the wayside. The new conspiracism is something different. There is no punctilious demand for proofs, no exhaustive amassing of evidence, no dots revealed to form a pattern, no close examination of the operators in the shadows. The new conspiracism dispenses with the burden of explanation. Instead, we have innuendo and verbal gesture. A lot of people are saying. Or we have bare assertion. Rigged! A one-word exclamation that evokes fantastic schemes, sinister motives, and the awesome capacity to mobilize. This is conspiracy without the theory. The conspiracist is not particularly interested with the past, which sounds crazy. They constantly ruminate over past events after all, and I think they do care a little bit about what they think happened in the past, but they are primarily interested in implementing their beliefs in the future. Seeing Howard drawn and quartered is the end goal of Port Arthur truth. Emotional truth supersedes logic in the brain. We are finally able to discuss the aftershocks of Pizzagate, because there is no logical way to understand why a man would storm a pizza parlor to rescue children from a non-existent basement. It is a crash at the intersection of cognitive dissonance, conservative libertarianism, and emotional truth that QAnon was first created in.
I like how Rothschild describes the movement best. QAnon, a cult, a popular movement, a puzzle, a community, a way to fight back against evil, a new religion, a wedge between countless loved ones, a domestic terrorism threat, and more than anything, a conspiracy theory about anything.
If you don't understand anything else about Q, you should at least understand this dimension. It's not just a conspiracy theory or game to these people, it's a ringside ticket to the final match between good and evil. When the hammer finally falls, the supporters of evil would need to be put down with brutal swiftness. The mix of biblical retribution, and particularly justice, has drawn fans from around the world.
QAnon is structured in an incredibly esoteric way. As it always does, it all started on 4chan. A random post credited to a top-secret government agent began leaking so-called top-secret information about a plan for Donald Trump to properly stop cultural Marxism, right? So, these posts are made up of cryptic and esoteric riddles that are tangentially related to each other. It is up to the Anons, sometimes referred to as patriots, to decode these clues properly, to do something. This community quickly became so toxic that they were banned from 4chan, which, by the pantheon of the gods, is one hell of an achievement. Imagine being banned from a den of neo-Nazis and pedophiles. Can you even comprehend how much rot and filth these people have to spit out to do that? QAnon moved to 8chan, which was way worse. The New Zealand shooter from Chapter 5, he posted his manifesto to 8chan. So after this, along with a bunch of QAnon stuff and some hate crimes, this caused 8chan to rebrand as 8kun, which is a derivative of Chan. Here, Q posted hundreds of times and the movement began to grow more and more extreme. QAnon was inescapable in conspiracy communities, and I can say this as someone who was keeping an eye on it. It was truly one of the most miserable and disgusting dens on the entire internet. Miserable people lurking in these spaces, upsetting everyone else and then coming back to feel better. This is the death rattle of a lot of frustrated and afraid people who seek comfort in some of the most painful and confusing information the internet has to offer. Now, I'm not the first person to describe QAnon as something of an abusive relationship, but there is something to this metaphor that I find compelling. Most relationships you will have in your life can be explained by attachment theory. So this comes from theorists of attachment and trauma. The classic example is this. Imagine you, B, are walking through the park with a toddler, A. You come across someone and their dog, C. The toddler wants to say hello to the dog, and the dog's owner says that the child can pet the dog. So, the child walks towards the dog, and it barks at them. The child screams and runs back to you. They are emotionally attached to you, and they seek your comfort. You reassure the toddler and encourage them to pet the dog. With renewed courage, the child walks over to the dog and pets it. The child gets a dopamine rush, and you tell the child that you are proud of them for overcoming their momentary fear. All relationships the toddler has, whether it be with a parent, a partner, or a friend, will feature moments where they are afraid, and then they will seek comfort and encouragement from someone they love. And in a normal and healthy relationship, they will support their partner, and their partner will support them, and they will both grow as people together. Alexandria Stein posits that at the core of an abusive relationship is when A is in a relationship with B, and B is very cruel to them. So many people are able to leave that relationship, but if A is especially dedicated and emotionally involved with B, we have this cycle where B constantly hurts A with C, and A will keep trying to return to B for comfort. Stein calls this relationship disorganized attachment.
The frightened, stressed follower who runs to someone, to the leader or group.
Stein talks about disorganized attachment in the context of cults. But there is something to this observation that can help us understand why certain people stay in these miserable conspiracy theories, even though it clearly upsets them.
Ultimately, Q tells a story, and it's one that its followers want to be told. Understanding the nuances of that story, and what about it is so appealing to believers, is the first key to unlocking the puzzle that is Q.
All of this is relevant because Port Arthur Truth was quickly adopted by QAnon to explain gun control laws. Cluster B of Port Arthur Truth are overwhelmingly QAnon refugees. They hold quite a large sway in this movement.
They're constantly referencing deleted YouTube channels and Q drops. Specifically, this group really liked serial Brain 2, who was one of the 12 authors of one of the biggest QAnon sources, QAnon: An Invitation to the Great Awakening. The rabbit hole here goes deep.
So we have many Port Arthur truthers who believe that John Howard is a communist pedophile who traffics children to his political colleagues. This is not an exaggeration, and I struggle not to laugh when I say it. You know, they cite no truth and they come out with these wild accusations left and right. On a traditional political compass, Howard was a conservative, xenophobic prime minister. These people should love him, but because they have him in the middle of their favorite conspiracy theory, they will always hate him. Not because they have any well thought out disagreements with his policies, but because their gut feelings believe he is evil incarnate. QAnon is understood as a big tent conspiracy, which means that it is so broad that anything can fit inside of it. Port Arthur fits inside this decades-old Machiavellian plot as being a precursor to some fantastical crackdown on some American conservative civil rights. It's ridiculous. Pats often care more about what's happening in America than they do in our own country. When One Nation was caught out trying to solicit money from the National Rifle Association and the Koch brothers, they were not screaming about treason. They were welcoming One Nation because they were actually exposed as Port Arthur truthers.
Analysis of conspiracy theory usually stops here. They usually take a somewhat condescending position of the theorist. Let's take, for example, Tom Nicholls, the author of The Death of Expertise.
Conspiracy theories are deeply attractive to people who have had a hard time making sense of a complicated world and who have no patience for less dramatic explanations. Such theories also appeal to a strong streak of narcissism. There are people who would choose to believe in complicated nonsense than accept their own circumstances are incomprehensible.
Which, yes, is a somewhat accurate assessment, but it is merely a flesh wound. If we want to understand what this libidinal drive is really about, we need to first answer the question that most conspiracy theory theorists shy away from. What is this elusive epistemic critique? Well, I plan to dissect that critique in part 4, but before we can do that, we need to understand how wrong Port Arthur truth is, how terrible their arguments are. Then only then can we begin to understand how someone can justify, in their own minds, these terrible arguments.
QAnon changed the way Port Arthur truth conducts itself. It further radicalized individuals, recontextualized certain beliefs, and taught a very old dog some dirty new tricks. And I was unfortunate enough to watch it all unfold.
On the 23rd of May, 2021, Channel 7 aired a new episode of their 7 News Spotlight investigation series. This episode was titled Blondie, Dark Secrets. Presented by Denham Hitchcock, this piece explores rumours about Blondie's involvement in 2 prior crimes before the Port Arthur Massacre. They ask, if he was convicted for these crimes, would the massacre have ever happened? Which is a redundant question to ask, but it is provocative enough for a tabloid news program to fund an overproduced and tasteless 50-minute piece of filler.
This is a poor excuse for journalism, and it doesn't help in mixing up the actual facts of the case. The program claims to investigate the death of Helen Harvey and the suicide of Maurice Bryant.
There is an unusual fixation with what the killer looks like now. The program prominently shows pictures of Blondie for other years in prison, and they fixate upon his weight gain.
Obviously his long blonde hair was gone, and he began to put on weight, body and face, virtually unrecognisable.
There's also this really gross infatuation with the supposed sexual favours the killer gives in prison.
He has increased his calorie intake due to sexual favours.
So getting paid for sexual favours?
Not money, but items, foodstuffs, chocolate.
It's unbelievably juvenile. These are meant to be something that we laugh at. We're meant to look at the killer and see how pathetic he is now. And I agree that the man who did the Port Arthur Massacre is indeed very pathetic, but this is far from the public interest to know about these sexual assaults. This is tabloid journalism, and it is a cheap fixation when there are more interesting things to teach the public about.
Our investigation will take 6 months, hundreds of phone calls, a journey across 3 states. The result? New witnesses, long-lost documents, and unseen video.
It does not uncover any evidence to support these new claims. Before I criticize it, this program is not inherently useless. There is an interesting interview with Marion Lana, who was harassed by Blondie in the years leading up to the massacre. You might remember her as the person Blondie stopped to see directly before arriving at Port Arthur. Now, the evidence presented by the program in the case of Miss Harvey's death claims that Blondie drove the car into oncoming traffic with the intention to claim his inheritance from her.
This is the exact location where Helen Harvey's car ran off the road. It was an accident that killed her. In the passenger seat and also injured was a young Martin Bryant. Now, at the time, it was treated as an accident, nothing more. But that is not the whole story.
When Helen Harvey died, Blondie was in the car next to her. So the theory goes that he grabbed the wheel when he was right next to her, causing her to go into oncoming traffic and then dying. Now, Blondie was in hospital for 7 months after this, and this is a ridiculous allegation. Here's why.
Blondie's was not a death wish, but a sudden, childlike impulse, one he could neither control nor suppress. Worse still, he had no ability to understand the potentially fatal consequences of his actions. Blondie appeared to be oblivious to external stimuli, such as pain and the cold, a characteristic often seen in children and adults with Asperger's. Now, he not only appeared to fear nothing, but also felt very little, viewing the world through a childish cartoon like a prism. But in real life, a car hurtling out of control can kill.
The evidence presented by the program in the case of Miss Harvey's death claims that Blondie drove the car into oncoming traffic with the intention to kill her and claim her inheritance.
If police had looked into that crash properly, is there a possibility that Port Arthur, the massacre there, would never have happened?
Well, he wouldn't have been out running around, would he?
This simplifies a much more complicated situation.
The most immediately offensive thing to me is this idea that Blondie had this inherent kind of criminality. He did an evil thing, therefore he was always evil. It's black and white thinking. There were many factors that led to his decision to autonomously commit the Port Arthur massacre, and I do not excuse the man for his sick and horrific crimes. But the reality is that if Blondie had received help with his mental health, and had any kind of structure to his life, like a regular job, he would most likely have not planned out the Port Arthur massacre. To simplify like this is irresponsible, to say the least. This also completely disregards the relationship between Blondie and Harvey. So, Blondie was a friendless loser who had no purpose in his life. When he chanced upon Miss Harvey, he found a friend. The relationship was not a sexual one, but it did have a deep connection. Harvey was the first person in Blondie's life who accepted him for who he was. This was the first person who he could talk to and share his life with. Harvey also benefited from this relationship. She had been living with a disabled mother, and after she died due to severe neglect, she lived alone in a mansion filled with 40 dogs and cats. Anyone with that many animals in their life certainly feels some kind of lack. Hitchcock suggests that Blondie purposefully killed his only friend for money, which is ludicrous. Blondie showed an uncharacteristic amount of grief over her loss, and what Hitchcock omits is that childlike impulse. He assigns malice to someone who did not have it.
Now, I think it is very unethical to present this story like this. You have either omitted the facts, or you have ignored them to sell your story. And how can you claim you've done 6 months of research if you get such a basic thing wrong? In regards to Maurice Bryant's suicide, the argument being presented in the program is one again of financial interest.
So, father Maurice Bryant is missing, but his son does nothing. Instead, it's a visitor to the Bryant property who eventually raises the alarm after seeing a note, apparently in Maurice's handwriting, pinned to the front door.
We were both at the academy at the time, and from my recollection, we got called in.
A farmer was missing down at Copping, suspected that he had probably suicided.
So what the program presents here is that Blondie plotted to kill his dad so he could not only control his inherited estate, but also to cash in on Maurice's life insurance and superannuation fund. Now Hitchcock claims to uncover new evidence on this front.
I'm in the National Archives office in Hobart, and they hold the last will and testament for everyone here in Tasmania. This is the will of Maurice Bryant, his investment fund to his son.
$250,000 from his father's will. More than enough money to buy as many high-powered weapons as he liked.
Now, I suppose from a historical perspective, it is mildly interesting to see some blurry close-ups of this document. But it doesn't matter that he found this document in the public records, because this was already public information. Anyone interested in this case already knows that Maurice left his estate to his son. Hitchcock and the program are presenting this as evidence for one thing while saying another. They present this situation as if Maurice was the sole trustee of Harvey's estate, which is demonstrably false. While it's true that it is curious that both of these deaths happened within the space of 10 months, Maurice was not the only trustee. In fact, as established in Part 1, Chapter 3 of this series, a public trustee was assigned to manage Blondie's inheritance. To omit this, or to ignore it, is ridiculous. In fact, the coroner concluded that Maurice died from suicide. It wasn't a nebulous police force, it was a coroner. The water in his lungs suggested he was not thrown into the water posthumously.
While Maurice had a long history of depression and anxiety, Blondie did not hold any malice against his father, even if he didn't show his grief appropriately in the suicide's wake. The program is aiming to be controversial and bold. It claims to have found new evidence when it is indeed found nothing. And it especially doesn't help that they seem to have been marketing it, however intentionally, to the conspiracy crowd. So this program was released to commemorate the 25th anniversary of the massacre, and based on my own observations, groups like Port Arthur Tasmania Exposed and Port Arthur The Truth on Facebook were both incredibly excited for the program's release. The provocative title was titillating to them. As conspiracy theorists often do, their imaginations went wild. They thought that the reference to dark secrets were actually what they had been theorizing about all along. Imagine their shock when it came out that this shoddy piece of overproduced tabloid-tier journalism was not about that. Disappointment turned into frustration. Frustration became anger, and anger became a rallying cry. In these groups, they planned to bomb and raid the comment sections of every single Channel 7 post for weeks on end. You can check the comments from May 2021. You can see these people coming out hard, assertive conspiratorial accusations with no proof or explanation. They do not argue with people, they just shitpost.
Shitposting is internet slang for a kind of content delivery. In my experience, shitposting primarily comes from fandoms. Content is primarily made up of low-effort original content, or OC, and it is not meant to be taken seriously. So tactics developed by the goblins over at 4chan recontextualize this. Shitposting as online harassment is flooding an online space with so much mess that it becomes illegible, hijacking the original purpose of the post. Shitposting therefore becomes an incredibly effective way to spread a message. The recency effect makes us more likely to remember something short and provocative. They spread their message, maybe getting a few people curious about the movement, but the main purpose of this organization is to build camaraderie between members.
This is an incredibly interesting time to observe this particular conspiracy theory. It's not quite popular enough yet to gain any kind of mainstream attention, but it is just getting big enough that savvy people are starting to pay attention to them again. As discussed in Chapter 5, the infrastructure set up by the New Zealand faction exposed much of this community to QAnon. The conspiracy as it exists right now is completely different from how Altman wrote about them. It is different from how Vomard wrote about them. It is different from how Hazelwood wrote about them. All the QAnon formers are bolstering the ranks and stirring up angry sentiments in these groups. Cluster B are leading the charge. They have brought their online harassment tactics with them, and they are teaching them to port off the truth. They are far more radical than they have ever been before, and they are growing more confident by the month. I worry that the group will begin to use their newfound tactics to mobilize and cause further harm. So, I have been planning this out for months to get ahead of the tsunami of bile that lays ahead of us. We have talked about who Port Arthur Truth are, what they are, what they're informed by, what kind of politics they follow, where their sources are, and many, many more things. But to debunk Port Arthur Truth, we have to finally discuss what these people actually believe, what are their arguments, and why precisely are they wrong? To answer those very important questions, we need an entire part dedicated to it. So, join us on the next episode of Acne and Coleslaw, Episode 3. What are we calling Episode 3? But working title, Debunking Port Arthur Truth. I'm sure we'll think of something snappier. But the Spanish played! Okay, good. That's good. That's a wrap. Okay.
Oh, thank God that's over. I've worked every day on this episode, and every day it kept getting bigger and bigger. And I'm very excited to announce that Part 3 is only going to be bigger than this. I think Part 3 is going to be the best episode ever. So make sure that you comment, rate, and also subscribe. I was really happy with how the first video came out, and I've worked hard making this one better. But I know this is going to upset a lot of people, so every single share and every single like really helps with me feeling better about releasing this goddamn monstrosity of a series. Here's to many more. Oh boy, here we go.